The machine was dead. $5 million of precision German engineering. Silent. A $140 million contract hanging by a thread. 33 hours. 12 engineers, 3 software specialists. The actual manufacturer, flown in at emergency rates, walking out with their hands in the air. And standing in the back of that room, holding a gas station coffee in a dented thermos, was a man no one had bothered to look at twice. He wasn't a consultant, wasn't a VP, wasn't anyone with a business card worth keeping. He was the guy who fixed things when things broke. Nobody knew he was the only person in that building who understood what was actually wrong. Hit like. Drop your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The sound came first. Not a crash. Not an explosion. Not the kind of dramatic failure you could point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. It was something quieter, and in some ways much worse, a winding down, like a giant exhaling its last breath. The Assembly Line 7 at Ridgeway Technologies' flagship manufacturing plant in Columbus, Ohio, didn't scream when it died. It just stopped. One moment, the floor was doing what it always did. A controlled, thunderous orchestra of hydraulics and conveyor belts and robotic arms moving in the kind of perfect choreography that took years and tens of millions of dollars to engineer. The smell of machine oil and hot metal hung in the air the way it always did. The overhead lights cast their flat industrial glow across the floor. Workers moved in their routines, earbuds in, minds half somewhere else. And then, in the space of about 4 seconds, the whole thing went quiet. The conveyor belts stopped. The robotic arms froze mid-motion, locked in positions that looked almost human, like a crowd of people who'd all heard something terrible at the exact same moment. The diagnostic screens on the main control panel flickered twice, then displayed a single amber warning: thermal protection override, system halt. Marco Reyes, the floor supervisor on duty that night, had been working at Ridgeway for 11 years. He'd seen breakdowns before: a jammed conveyor, a blown hydraulic seal. Once, memorably, a raccoon that had somehow gotten into the secondary cooling unit and caused 3 hours of creative chaos. He knew how to handle problems. But when he walked to the main panel and read that screen, something in his gut told him this was different. He reached for his radio. "I need maintenance up here, right now." On the other side of the plant, in a narrow corridor that smelled like cleaning solution and old coffee, Daniel Brooks looked up from the workbench where he'd been replacing a sensor module on a secondary conveyor unit. His radio crackled with Marco's voice, and even through the static, he caught the edge in it. Daniel set down his screwdriver. He rolled his shoulder once, an old habit, something he did without thinking whenever something shifted in the air, and picked up his tool bag. He didn't run. Daniel Brooks never ran. He walked with the kind of deliberate calm that people sometimes mistook for indifference, but wasn't. It was the walk of someone who had learned, through years of hard experience, that panic made you miss things. By the time he reached line 7, Marco was already on the phone with someone, speaking in low, urgent tones. 3 other workers stood near the frozen assembly arm, staring at it the way you stare at a car crash, unable to look away, unable to do anything useful. Daniel set his bag down and looked at the control panel. Thermal protection override. System halt. He pulled out a small flashlight and crouched down near the base of the main drive unit. He spent about 2 minutes there, just looking, not touching anything yet, just looking. "What do you think?" Marco appeared beside him, phone still in hand. "I don't know yet," Daniel said. "That's helpful." "You want helpful? Or you want honest?" Marco made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "What's the thermal reading showing?" "Says it hit 247 Celsius on the primary drive housing." Daniel stood up. "But it doesn't feel like it ran that hot. Floor's not warm. The smell's wrong." "Wrong how?" "When a motor overheats, there's a specific smell. Burning varnish from the copper windings. You'd know it if you'd smelled it." He paused. "I'm not smelling that." Marco looked at him. "So what are you smelling?" "Nothing. That's the problem." He opened the primary access panel and started working through a preliminary check. Power distribution, fine. Cooling system intake, clear. Emergency shutoff relay. tripped, but that was expected given the override. He reset it, attempted a manual restart sequence. Nothing. The screen stayed dark. "All right," Marco said quietly. "I'm calling Hendricks." Raymond Hendricks was the plant's chief engineer, 58 years old, 22 years with Ridgway, and the kind of man who communicated primarily through disapproving silences and the strategic use of the phrase "that shouldn't happen." When he arrived on the floor at 12:40 in the morning, still wearing what appeared to be his dinner clothes, he looked at the frozen assembly line like it had personally offended him. He looked at Daniel crouched near the base panel. "What's the maintenance guy doing?" he asked Marco. "Trying to find the fault." Hendricks made a noise. "Step back," he said to Daniel. Not unkindly, just with the casual authority of a man who had never had a reason to consider that someone below him on the organizational chart might know something he didn't. "Let me take a look." Daniel stepped back. He picked up his thermos from where he'd set it on a nearby workbench. He drank his coffee. He watched. By 3 in the morning, Hendricks had called in 2 of his senior engineers. By 5, there were 4 of them crowded around the control panel, running diagnostics from a laptop they'd connected directly to the machine system interface. By 7, the start of the day shift, the floor had come to a complete standstill. Workers arrived to find Line 7 dark and silent and surrounded by engineers. And the news spread through the building with the particular velocity that bad news always travels in places where people's paychecks depend on things working. Daniel's shift had technically ended at 6. He stayed anyway. He didn't ask anyone if that was okay. He just stayed, moving back whenever the engineers needed space, keeping himself quiet and peripheral, watching. He'd called his sister Helen at 5:45, told her he'd be late picking up Sophie, and listened to the 40-second silence that meant Helen was calculating how much this was going to cost her in schedule adjustments before she said, "Fine, just let me know." On the floor, the diagnostic effort was deepening into something more organized and simultaneously more desperate. The machine's control system had generated an error log. The engineers printed it out, 17 pages of system data, and spread it across a folding table they'd set up near the main panel. Marcus Webb, the youngest of the senior engineers, a 29-year-old from Georgia Tech who wore his confidence the way some people wore cologne, constantly and perhaps slightly too much, was the first to start cross-referencing the log against the machine's technical documentation. "Thermal sensor array on the primary drive housing," he said, tapping the printout. "Look at these readings. Temperature spiked over a 3-minute window. 212, 228, 247. The system read that as a critical overtemp event and executed the protection protocol." "Can we override the protection protocol and restart?" another engineer asked. "We can, but if the actual temperature was that high, we risk destroying the drive housing, and that's a $400,000 component." "The temperature wasn't that high," Daniel said. He hadn't moved from his spot near the wall. He said it quietly, not aggressively. Just a statement of fact dropped into the conversation like a stone into water. 4 engineers turned to look at him. Webb's expression did something complicated. Not quite a sneer. More the expression of someone performing patience for an audience. "What makes you say that?" "Motor hasn't got the smell, floor temperature around the unit hasn't changed, and the reading spiked too fast. Real thermal buildup doesn't climb like that over 3 minutes unless there's a catastrophic failure, and if there'd been a catastrophic failure, we'd be looking at physical damage. We're not." Webb looked at him for a moment. "You're the maintenance tech?" "Yeah." "Right." Webb turned back to his colleagues. "So the sensor data could be inaccurate. Could be a faulty sensor reporting a false high." "That's what I just said," Daniel said. "I know. I'm saying it to my team." Webb didn't look at him again. "Let's pull the sensor array diagnostics." Daniel finished his coffee. He looked at the machine. He thought about the oxide layer he'd seen on a relay component when he'd had the access panel open earlier. Just a glimpse, brief, in the sweep of his flashlight. He'd filed it away in the back of his mind the way he filed everything, quietly, without making a show of it. He didn't say anything about it yet. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he wasn't certain enough. Maybe because he was tired and second-guessing himself. Maybe, and this was the thought he didn't want to look at directly, because he'd been in rooms like this before, on the other side of the table, and he knew how they worked. He knew what happened when someone brought a half-formed idea into a room full of engineers running on no sleep and a lot of institutional pressure. You got one shot. You had to be sure. He wasn't sure yet, so he waited. Olivia Hart arrived at the plant at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, wearing clothes that had clearly been chosen for a different kind of day. Sharp gray blazer, dark slacks, the kind of put-together look that means a series of meetings with important people. She was 30 years old, which was young for a CEO, and she knew it, and which meant she'd spent most of her professional life in rooms where the first thing people did upon meeting her was recalibrate their expectations downward. She had learned to use that. She had learned to let people underestimate her right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. But walking onto the floor of Plant 7 at Ridgeway Technologies and seeing Assembly Line 7 standing cold and silent, that was a specific kind of dread that strategy and composure couldn't entirely armor against. She'd been briefed by phone while still in the car. Machine down, Line 7, thermal protection event, engineers on it since midnight, no restart yet. What the briefing hadn't captured was the atmosphere of the place. The day shift workers clustered in small groups near the edges of the floor, speaking in low voices. The folding table with its spread of technical documents. The 4 engineers looking increasingly strained around the central panel. And the quiet man standing near the wall with a thermos who looked like he hadn't slept and didn't particularly seem bothered by that. Olivia's operations director, Patrick Crane, materialized beside her with a tablet and a grim expression. Patrick was 51, intensely competent, and had a gift for presenting catastrophic information with the tone of someone reporting mild weather. "So," he said, "where are we?" "They've been running diagnostics since midnight. Current working theory is a faulty thermal sensor generating false overtemp readings. They're trying to isolate whether it's a sensor issue or something in the reporting circuit. How long to fix? Unknown. If it's just the sensor, possibly a few hours. If it's in the control circuit..." He paused. "Patrick. Could be days, possibly longer." Olivia looked at the machine. She thought about Marcus Elmwood, the VP of procurement at Fletcher Industrial, who had spent the last 4 months finding reasons to delay signing the $140 million supply contract, reasons that Olivia had systematically and painstakingly eliminated one by one until 2 weeks ago when Elmwood had finally, reluctantly, agreed to bring his inspection team to Columbus in 3 weeks. To see the plant, to see the operation running, to sign the paperwork. 3 weeks. "What's the worst-case scenario?" she asked. "If we can't get the line running before the Fletcher inspection." "That's not the worst case. The worst case is we can't get it running at all." She looked at him. "What's the actual worst case?" Patrick's expression shifted slightly. "The machine's manufacturer is being contacted. If there's a fundamental control system issue, a hardware failure in the main processing unit, we're looking at a full system replacement. Cost? North of $1 million, and 8 to 12 weeks for delivery and installation." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Get me Hendricks," she said. The manufacturer's technical team arrived by private car from their regional service center in Cleveland that afternoon. 2 men, professional, efficient, carrying equipment cases with the focused energy of people who had done this many times before. They spent 6 hours running their own diagnostic protocols. At 10 o'clock Tuesday night, the lead technician asked to speak with Olivia privately. They stood in the corridor outside the floor, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The technician, his name was Garvey, and he had the careful eyes of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in ways that softened liability without obscuring reality, looked at his tablet, then at Olivia. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "We've run every standard diagnostic our system supports. The error logs point to a sensor malfunction, but we can't find a hardware fault in the sensor array itself. The sensors are registering correctly when we test them in isolation. So the sensor tests fine, but the system thinks the machine is overheating." "Yes. And you don't know why." A pause. "Our best guess is an intermittent fault somewhere in the reporting circuit. The kind of failure that shows up only under specific operating conditions, temperature, load, humidity, and disappears when you're looking directly at it." "Intermittent faults," Olivia said. "How do you fix those?" "You replace the system components until you find it. Or He stopped. Or you replace the entire control system, which eliminates the fault entirely because you're starting fresh. What does that cost? Garvey told her. She looked at the wall for a moment. Give me until morning, she said. She went back to the floor. The engineers were still there. Hendricks had gone home for a few hours, but Webb and two others were still running tests. The machine sat dark and still. The overnight maintenance crew moved around it like people moving around a sleeping animal they weren't sure about. Daniel was still there too. He'd gone home at some point. She'd noticed his absence around 5 in the afternoon. But he was back now, and from the look of him, he'd changed clothes and gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep. He was standing near the main panel, not doing anything in particular, just looking. Olivia walked over. She'd noticed him that morning without really registering him. The quiet man with the thermos. Now she looked at him properly. He was in his early 30s, she guessed. Maintenance uniform. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Not unfriendly, not distant, just measured. Like someone who'd learned to keep what he was thinking to himself until he was ready to say it. You've been here since last night, she said. It wasn't a question. I come back on at 11, he said. I've been here since about 9. But you were here this morning too. Yeah. Your maintenance? Maintenance technician, night shift. He extended a hand. Daniel Brooks. She shook it. Olivia Hart. I know who you are. Something in his tone wasn't deferential or nervous, just matter of fact. She found herself recalibrating slightly without entirely knowing why. Have you found anything? He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the pause of someone who didn't have an answer. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to say the thing they were thinking. Maybe, he said. I'm not sure enough to say yet. We have a manufacturer's team saying they can't identify the fault. We have 4 engineers who've been running diagnostics for 24 hours. We have $1 million system replacement on the table. If you've found something, I said maybe. He looked at her. I don't want to send you in the wrong direction. I'd rather have a maybe than $1 million guess, she said. He almost smiled at that. Not quite. There's a relay component. Secondary voltage regulation runs off the main control bus. When I had the side panel open last night, I caught a look at it under flashlight. Looked like it might have some oxidation on the contact surface. She stared at him. Oxidation. It's a specific kind of failure. The oxide layer acts like a resistor, creates a voltage drop across the relay contact. Under normal conditions, it's negligible, but under load with the right temperature and humidity conditions, it can generate a false signal. In this case, he stopped. I'd need to pull the component to be sure, and I'd need to test it properly. Why haven't you said something before now? The look he gave her was patient, and she thought, not entirely without a kind of rueful humor. I mentioned the temperature reading to the engineers this morning. They didn't. He paused. They were focused on other things. He meant they hadn't listened. She understood that without him having to say it. Pull the component, she said. I'd want to look at it first, confirm what I'm seeing. Then look at it. He looked at her for a moment, the look of someone checking whether she meant it. Then he picked up his tool bag. Okay, he said. The access panel was on the left side of the machine, low down, close to the floor. It was the kind of panel that wasn't listed prominently in the standard maintenance schedule because the component it housed was rated for a service life of 15 years and was considered, in the design documentation, essentially maintenance-free. It was also the kind of panel that the diagnostic software didn't query directly because the component wasn't part of the primary system monitoring loop. It sat in a secondary circuit, a background process, essentially, that the system's software treated as assumed functional unless it generated a specific error code. It hadn't generated an error code. That was the point. Daniel knelt down and opened the panel. He angled his flashlight into the space, and what he saw confirmed what he'd seen the night before. The relay, a small component, maybe 3 inches long, housed in a gray polymer casing, had a faint iridescent discoloration on its copper contact surfaces. The kind of thing that was easy to miss in poor light, and essentially invisible to a diagnostic scan that wasn't looking for it, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Webb appeared behind him. He'd seen Olivia talking to the maintenance tech and had positioned himself to observe. "What are you doing?" he asked. His tone was professional, barely. "Looking at the secondary voltage relay," Daniel said. "That component's not in the fault analysis." "I know." "The diagnostic system would have flagged it if there was a problem." "The diagnostic system doesn't directly monitor this relay. It's in a passive circuit." A pause. "How do you know that?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was examining the relay contact surface with a magnification loupe. The oxidation was there. Light, uniform, the kind of coating that built up gradually over years and became a problem only when a specific combination of factors aligned. In this case, slightly elevated ambient humidity over the past week, Columbus had gotten 4 days of rain, combined with load conditions during a particularly high-output production run. The oxide layer had hit a resistance threshold. The relay had started generating a fractional voltage irregularity, and that irregularity had propagated up through the secondary circuit into the thermal monitoring system, where it had been interpreted as a temperature spike. The machine had shut itself down to prevent damage from an overheating event that had never happened. "How do you know that?" Webb repeated. "I read the design documentation," Daniel said. He pulled the relay carefully from its socket, turned it in the light. "When I first started working this line, I read the full technical manual, all of it." Something in the way he said all of it made Webb go quiet. Daniel held the relay up. In the flat industrial light, the oxidation was visible as a subtle sheen on the contact surfaces, if you knew to look for it, if you'd ever seen it before. "This is your fault," he said. "Oxide layer on the contact surface. It's been building up over time. Under the conditions of the last few days, humidity's been up and you had a high-load production run last Friday. It hit a threshold, started generating a voltage irregularity in the secondary circuit. The thermal monitoring system read it as a temperature event." Webb stared at the component. His expression went through several phases: skepticism, consideration, and then something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. "The sensor array tests fine in isolation," he said slowly, "because the sensor is fine. The problem isn't the sensor. The problem is what the sensor's receiving." A long silence. "The fix," Daniel said, "is cleaning the contact surface and reinstalling, or replacing the relay entirely. Should take about 20 minutes. Webb looked at him. "At the relay?" Back at him. "And if you're wrong," he said, "if we reinstall that component and restart the system and there's an actual fault somewhere else, if I'm wrong, the system throws another error code and we're back where we started." Daniel met his eyes. "We're already where we started." Another silence. "Let me get Hendricks," Webb said. It was nearly 2 in the morning on Wednesday when Olivia called everyone back to the floor. She'd been in the building for 18 hours. Her blazer was on the back of a chair somewhere. She had a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she was standing near the main control panel with Patrick, listening to Hendricks explain why they should probably not let the maintenance technician attempt a repair based on his own assessment of a component that the manufacturer's team hadn't flagged. "He could be right," Hendricks said. "I'm not saying he's wrong, but we're talking about the primary control system of a $5 million machine. If he restores that relay and restarts the system and there's a fault somewhere else that we haven't found, what happens?" Olivia asked. "Best case, we throw another error and we're back to square one. Worst case, we restart without protection and damage the drive housing, which is a $400,000 component." "Yes. And the alternative is a $1 million system replacement and 8 to 12 weeks of downtime." Hendricks said nothing. That silence was its own kind of answer. Olivia looked across the floor to where Daniel was standing near the machine, relay in hand, waiting. He'd been waiting for 40 minutes while the conversation happened without him. She walked over. "Here's where I am," she said. "Hendricks is worried about liability if your diagnosis is wrong. The manufacturer wants us to go with the system replacement, which is the safe option from their perspective, and coincidentally the option where they make $1 million. And I have 3 weeks until an inspection that will determine whether this company keeps its biggest prospective contract." Daniel listened. He didn't say anything. "Tell me why you're right," she said. "I can't prove it without testing," he said. "That's the honest answer. The oxidation is visible and it's consistent with the failure pattern. The false thermal spike, the timing, the fact that it only happened under specific load and humidity conditions. Everything points to this relay, but the only way to know for certain is to clean the contact, reinstall it, and restart. And if you're wrong? If I'm wrong, you haven't lost anything. You haven't already lost. The machine is already down. The system replacement is still on the table either way. She looked at him for a long moment. How long do you need? Give me 5 minutes to clean the contact surface. Another 2 to reinstall. Then we restart. 5 minutes, she said. You've got it. She turned to face the room. The engineers, the manufacturer's team, Patrick, a handful of supervisors who'd come in overnight. Maybe 20 people, all watching. Everyone stand back, she said. Give him room to work. Nobody moved immediately. There was a beat of that particular stillness that happens when something is about to change, and everyone in the room can feel it, but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Then someone stepped back, and then another person. And then the room arranged itself, and Daniel Brooks crouched down at the access panel with his tools, and the floor went quiet. Webb stood at the edge of the space. His arms were crossed. His face was doing something complicated. Daniel worked quietly. He didn't narrate what he was doing. He didn't explain each step. He cleaned the relay contact surface with a fine cleaning solution, dried it carefully, inspected it again under magnification, and reinstalled the component into its socket. He ran a manual function check on the secondary circuit. He closed the access panel. He stood up. You can restart, he said. Nobody moved. Restart the system, Olivia said. Marco Reyes stepped to the main control panel. He entered the startup sequence. The control screens flickered. A loading indicator appeared. A second passed. 5 seconds. The screen stayed dark. In the silence, someone coughed. Somewhere in the back, Olivia heard Patrick exhale. Then the control screens lit up. A cascade of green status indicators running down the list. Primary power. Nominal. Drive housing temperature. Nominal. Hydraulic pressure. Nominal. Safety interlocks. Cleared. Cooling system. Online. The machine made a sound, a low resonant hum, building from somewhere deep in its chassis. The robotic arms stirred, ran a slow calibration sweep. The conveyor belt moved, just slightly, just testing, and then locked into its operating rhythm. Assembly Line 7 came back to life. The noise of it, the real, full, operational noise of $5 million of machinery doing what it was designed to do, filled the floor like something physical, like a pressure change, like the air itself had decided to unclench. Nobody cheered. Not immediately. The room just stood there, watching it run, processing the fact that it was running, and that it was running because of a man nobody had thought to ask, not because they hadn't needed to, but because they'd never imagined they might. Webb uncrossed his arms. He looked at the machine. He looked at Daniel. He didn't say anything. Neither did Daniel. The line ran. In the hours that followed, there was plenty of noise. Olivia called the Fletcher Industrial contact at 7 in the morning and left a message. Production had resumed. Everything was on schedule. Patrick organized a full system check to run alongside the operating line, ensuring that the relay fix had fully resolved the fault. It had. Hendricks wrote up an incident report that carefully documented the diagnostic process without, Olivia noticed, ever quite resolving the question of why a maintenance technician had found the fault that 4 engineers and a manufacturer's team had missed. Daniel finished his shift at 6 in the morning. He filed his own maintenance report, brief, factual, no editorial, describing the component inspection, the finding, the fix, and the restart. He put his thermos in his bag. He said goodbye to Marco. He walked out to the parking lot. He drove to his sister Helen's house, where Sophie was still asleep in the spare room. He sat at Helen's kitchen table and drank the coffee she made him without being asked, and he looked out her kitchen window at the gray Columbus morning, and he didn't think about the machine or the relay or the 33 hours he'd spent on a factory floor while people looked through him. He thought about Sophie's school pickup, about a permission slip he needed to sign, about whether there was anything in his apartment for dinner or whether this was going to be a breakfast for dinner situation, which Sophie always treated as a special occasion even though it was usually just a logistical failure on his part. Helen sat down across from him with her own coffee. She looked at him for a moment. Good shift? She asked. Weird one, he said. You fix whatever it was? He thought about the relay. About the relay in his hand at 2 in the morning, the iridescent sheen on the copper contacts, the room full of people watching. Yeah, he said. I fixed it. Helen nodded. She knew better than to push. That was one of the things Daniel valued most about her. He finished his coffee. He went in to check on Sophie, still asleep, curled on her side with her hair in her face, 7 years old, and entirely unaware that her father had just saved a $140 million contract for a company that hadn't known who he was. He tucked the blanket more closely around her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went home to sign the permission slip. So, back at the plant, Olivia sat in her office with the door closed for the first time in 36 hours. She had a list of things to do, calls to make, a board update to prepare, a note to send to the Fletcher team, a dozen decisions waiting for her attention, backed up like cars on a highway with an accident cleared. She opened her laptop. She typed Daniel Brooks Ridgeway Maintenance Night Shift into the HR system. She read what came back. She read it again. Then she set her coffee down carefully and looked out her office window at the parking lot below. She thought about a man she'd hired 2.5 years ago for a maintenance technician position. About a resume that had been, she now realized, dramatically, almost absurdly, underqualified for the role on paper, because of what was missing from it, not what was there. About a background check that had come back clean and unremarkable. About a quiet man who had shown up for every shift and fixed things when they broke and gone home, and apparently never said a word to anyone about who he was. She thought about him standing near the wall with his thermos, about the engineers who'd looked through him, about the way he'd said, I read the design documentation with that patient, almost rueful edge. She thought about what it must have felt like to stand in that room, knowing something that nobody else knew and having nobody think to ask. She picked up her phone. Patrick, she said when he answered, I need you to pull the full file on one of our maintenance technicians. His name is Daniel Brooks. She paused. I think we need to have a conversation. The line ran all that day and through the night. It ran clean and steady, the way it was supposed to. Workers came back to their stations. The rhythm of the floor reasserted itself. By Thursday morning, they'd made up nearly 40% of the production time lost. In the maintenance log, filed under routine work orders, was a single entry. Secondary voltage relay, circuit B7, assembly line 7. Inspected, cleaned, reinstalled. Thermal override fault resolved. System returned to operational status. Dio Brooks, Maintenance Technician 3, Night Shift. 40 words. For 33 hours of failure, $1 million averted, and a $140 million contract preserved. Nobody had asked for more than that. Daniel hadn't offered it, but Olivia Hart had read it 3 times, and she was still thinking about it. Patrick Crane had worked for Olivia Hart for 4 years, and in that time he had developed a reliable internal gauge for her moods. There was the focused calm she carried into board meetings, controlled, deliberate, every sentence weighted before it left her mouth. There was the particular set of her jaw during difficult negotiations when she was doing the math in real time and not letting you see the numbers. And then there was this, the way she got very still and very quiet when she'd found something that didn't fit the shape of the world she thought she understood. She was doing that now. Patrick sat across from her desk with the HR file open on his tablet, watching her read. She'd asked him to pull it and bring it to her personally, not email it, not forward it through the system. And that alone had told him something. Olivia Hart was not a woman who asked for things to be hand-delivered unless she wasn't sure what she was dealing with. She read for a long time. The office was quiet. Down the hall, someone was on a phone call, the voice carrying through the wall as a muffled rhythm without words. Outside her window, a delivery truck was pulling into the lot. His previous employer, she said finally, without looking up. Meridian Systems Group. Yes. He was a senior systems engineer there. Principal systems engineer. That's 2 levels above senior. Patrick paused. He had his own team. She looked up. For how long? 6 years. He joined them right out of his master's program at Carnegie Mellon, mechanical engineering, minor in electrical systems. He was with Meridian until Patrick checked the file. 7 years ago. And then? He left. No termination, no disciplinary record. Just resigned. There's a gap of about 14 months after that, and then he applied to us for a maintenance technician position. For a maintenance technician position. Patrick looked at her steadily. His application listed his Meridian employment, but described his role there as system support and technical maintenance, which is technically not inaccurate, depending on how you define the terms, but it's not what he was doing. Olivia set the tablet down. He was running industrial systems design projects. He had a team of 12 people. He filed patents. She picked up a single printed page. She'd had Patrick print the relevant section, which was not like her. She preferred screens. The paper meant she'd wanted to be sure she was reading it right. He has 4 patents listed in his name. One of them is on advanced relay circuit architecture for high-load industrial applications. The silence in the room had a particular texture. He designed relay systems, she said, and then he spent 2.5 years as our maintenance technician, fixing relay systems. Among other things, Patrick said carefully. Nobody caught this. When he applied, Patrick shifted in his chair. This was the part he'd been sitting with since she'd called him. His resume for this position didn't include the patents, didn't include his publication record. He has 3 papers in industry journals, apparently. He listed a degree and his employment history, described in fairly minimal terms. Our HR screener saw a candidate with a master's degree from a good school and relevant work experience and offered him the job. He paused. Nobody thought to dig deeper because nobody expected a person applying to be a maintenance technician to be hiding something, Olivia finished. He wasn't hiding anything illegal. He just didn't advertise. She looked out the window for a moment. When she turned back, something in her expression had shifted, not quite toward decision yet, but in that direction. There's a personal note in the file, from the intake form, the reason for seeking employment field. Patrick nodded. He'd read it. He let her say it. He wrote, I am looking for stable work with predictable hours. I have family responsibilities that require my full attention outside of work, and I am not seeking advancement at this time. She set the paper down. That's all. Yes. Family responsibilities, she said. That means he has a daughter, Sophie. She's 7. His wife, her name was Claire, died 6 years ago. Patrick kept his voice level, which required a small effort. Cardiac event. She was 29. The room was very quiet. So he left his career, Olivia said. Not a question. Working through it out loud the way she sometimes did when she needed to hear something to understand it fully. His wife died, he had a kid under 2 years old, and he walked away from a principal engineer position and took a job fixing machines on the night shift so he could be home during the day, Patrick said. Night shift ends at 6. His daughter's school starts at 8:15. He picks her up at 3. He's been doing that for 6 years. Olivia sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. It wasn't a gesture she made often. He found the fault, she said. In a machine his own patents helped design. Patrick hadn't made that connection yet. He looked at the file again. He found it. Patent number 4, filed 8 years ago, secondary relay circuit architecture for thermal monitoring integration in high-load industrial machinery. He looked up at her. He wasn't guessing, he said slowly. He knew exactly what to look for. He knew because he helped build the system that failed. She sat forward. And he stood there for 33 hours while we brought in experts and called manufacturers and talked about $1 million replacement, and he waited until I asked him directly before he said anything. Her voice was flat, but underneath it was something that might have been anger or might have been something harder to name. Why did he wait? Patrick thought about this. He tried, he said. Earlier. I talked to Marco, the floor supervisor. Daniel mentioned the temperature reading to the engineering team on Tuesday morning. Webb shut him down. Webb, she said. Webb's not a bad engineer. He looked at the maintenance tech and decided he didn't need to listen. She said it without heat, just naming a thing. And Daniel didn't push. No. She was quiet for a moment. Would you have? If you'd been in his position, if nobody was listening, if everyone had already made up their minds about what you were, would you have pushed harder? Patrick considered the question honestly. I don't know, he said. Maybe. Maybe not. He paused. 6 years is a long time to practice not drawing attention to yourself. That sat between them. Olivia stood up. She moved to the window, looking down at the plant floor below, visible through the glass, running clean and steady, the line that had been silent for 33 hours, now performing as though nothing had happened. As though a maintenance technician with a thermos and 4 patents to his name hadn't quietly saved the whole thing while everyone else was looking somewhere else. Set up a meeting with him, she said. End of this week. Don't tell him what it's about. Patrick started to write it down, then stopped. Should I tell him anything? Tell him I want to talk, that's all. She paused. And Patrick, don't make it formal, not a conference room. See if he'll come in during the day before his shift. Patrick looked at her. Why? Because a conference room with HR and legal and a formal agenda is going to make him think he's in trouble. And a man who spent 6 years being invisible on purpose is going to walk out the door if he thinks he's being summoned to defend himself. She turned from the window. I want him to actually show up. Patrick nodded. He gathered the file. He stood to go. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he said, Marco told me the engineers were still arguing about the relay theory when Daniel opened the panel. Webb was saying the oxidation reading was inconclusive. He looked at the floor for a moment. Marco said Daniel didn't argue back, just went to work. Olivia looked at him. Yeah, she said. That tracks. She went back to her desk after Patrick left. She had 17 things requiring her attention, and she worked through them steadily, efficiently, the way she always did. But between tasks, in the small gaps between one call ending and the next beginning, between one document finished and the next opened, she kept coming back to the same image. A man standing near a wall with a thermos, watching engineers argue about a problem he'd already solved, waiting to be asked, not quite believing he would be. It took her the better part of the afternoon to acknowledge that the image bothered her in a way that was more than professional. It bothered her because she recognized something in it. Not the same situation, not the same stakes. Her own invisibility had been more social than structural, more about people underestimating her age and her gender than about being in the wrong uniform. But the specific experience of standing in a room, knowing something that nobody thought you capable of knowing, and having to decide whether to push against the assumption or wait for a moment when it might actually land. That she understood. She'd spent most of her 20s in that room. She understood why Daniel Brooks had waited. She also understood that if she'd been in his position with a daughter to get home to and 6 years of practice quiet behind her, she might have waited longer. The thought sat with her uncomfortably for the rest of the day. She didn't do anything with it. She just let it sit. That was something she'd learned. Some thoughts weren't problems to solve. Some thoughts were just true, and you had to let them be true without immediately turning them into an action item. She went back to work. The line kept running. Daniel Brooks went home and made breakfast for dinner. Sophie thought it was the best night of the week. He didn't tell her why he was tired. He never did. The permission slip was for a field trip to a science museum on Friday. He signed it and put it in her backpack and made a mental note to pack an extra granola bar because Sophie always ate her lunch in the first 10 minutes and then spent the rest of the trip telling him she was hungry, a complaint he had no standing to argue with because he was exactly the same. He fell asleep on his couch at 8:30 with his shoes still on and a half-finished cup of tea going cold on the coffee table. Sophie found him there when she came out for a glass of water at 9, and she turned off the TV and draped a blanket over him with the particular careful gentleness of a 7-year-old who had been living with a tired father long enough to know the drill. She went back to bed. He didn't wake up until 11, stiff-necked and disoriented, the apartment dark and quiet around him. He sat for a moment in the dark. Then he got up, rinsed his mug, and went to bed. The call from Patrick Crane came the next afternoon. Daniel was in the middle of recalibrating a pressure sensor on line 3. A routine task, the kind of thing that required just enough concentration to keep his hands occupied and left his mind partially free. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, didn't recognize the number, and let it go to voicemail. He listened to it during his break, standing in the corridor near the break room with a fresh cup of coffee. Mr. Brooks, this is Patrick Crane. I'm the operations director here at Ridgeway. Olivia Hart would like to meet with you later this week, if you're available. Sometime before your shift would be ideal. She mentioned Thursday or Friday, whichever works better. It's nothing urgent, she just wanted to touch base about your work this week. Give me a call back when you get a chance. Daniel listened to it twice. He stood in the corridor and looked at the far wall and ran the message back through his head, the way he ran things back when he was looking for what was actually being said underneath what was said. Nothing urgent. Wanted to touch base. He'd been in this business long enough to know that when a CEO wanted to touch base with a night shift maintenance technician, something had shifted. The question was what exactly and in which direction. His first instinct, the instinct he'd cultivated deliberately over years, the one that said, stay small, stay quiet, don't let this become something, told him to call back, say he was available Thursday, and walk into that meeting prepared to be thanked briefly and then return to his lane. That was the most likely scenario. A polite acknowledgement. Maybe a small bonus. Definitely the implicit expectation that he'd keep doing exactly what he'd been doing. His second instinct, older, quieter, the one he'd mostly learned to ignore, recognized that Patrick Crane had said Olivia herself had asked for the meeting, and that a woman who'd spent the night on her plant floor and given a maintenance technician 5 minutes on nothing more than instinct and logic was not someone who called meetings purely for the sake of ceremony. He called back, got Patrick's voicemail, left a message saying Thursday worked. He went back to the pressure sensor. He didn't think about it again for the rest of the shift, or not consciously. But that night, putting Sophie to bed, she asked him why he had that look on his face. And he said, what look? And she said, the look like you're doing math in your head. And he said, I'm always doing math in my head. And she said, yeah, but usually it's quiet math. And he didn't entirely have an answer for that. Kids, he had found, were frequently more perceptive than the entire engineering department of a mid-sized manufacturing company. He kissed her forehead and turned off her light and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her settle, and he thought about Claire. Not with the sharp grief of the early years, but with the softer, stranger ache of later grief. The kind that arrived unexpectedly and felt less like pain and more like a question. What would she think of this? What would she say? She'd been the kind of person who always said what she thought, directly and without apology, which was one of the things that had been most inconvenient about her and most irreplaceable. She would have an opinion about this. She always had an opinion. He went to the kitchen and washed the dishes. He didn't know what the meeting would bring. He wasn't going to work himself up about it either way. He'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that the things you couldn't control were best approached with a kind of deliberate blankness. Not indifference exactly, more like a decision to let the thing be what it was going to be without loading it with expectation in either direction. The dish soap smelled like lemons. Sophie had picked it out at the grocery store because the bottle had a frog on it. He finished the dishes. He went to bed. Thursday came. The meeting was at 4 in the afternoon, which put it an hour before Daniel's shift started. He arrived in the lobby in his work clothes. He hadn't thought to change, and realized too late that he maybe should have, and then decided it didn't matter. He was a maintenance technician. Showing up in maintenance clothes seemed more honest than showing up in a button-down he'd have to explain. The receptionist knew his name. That was a small thing, but it registered. Patrick had told the front desk to expect him, which meant somebody had thought to prepare, which meant the meeting was more deliberate than the message had made it sound. He was taken to Olivia's office, not a conference room, her actual office, with a window and a desk that had papers on it and a dead plant in the corner that she clearly hadn't gotten around to replacing, and 2 chairs that didn't match in front of the desk, which he found inexplicably humanizing. She was on a call when he arrived. She held up a finger. 1 minute, and he sat down in the closer of the 2 mismatched chairs and looked at the window. Columbus in October. The trees were going. He liked this time of year. Sophie was obsessed with jumping in leaf piles, which seemed developmentally appropriate and also meant that every afternoon pickup involved the better part of a leaf pile relocating itself into the back seat of his car. Olivia ended the call. She set her phone face down on the desk. Thanks for coming in, she said. You want anything? Coffee? I'm fine, he said. And then, because the offer had been direct enough to warrant directness in return, what's this about? She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression settled, like a decision made. "I pulled your file," she said. He waited. "Your full background. Employment history, professional record." A pause. "The patents." He looked at the window, the trees. He looked back at her. "Okay," he said. "That's all you've got?" "What do you want me to say?" "I want to understand," she said, and her voice was direct without being unkind, the voice of someone who genuinely wanted information rather than a performance of wanting information. "You have a master's from Carnegie Mellon. You spent 6 years as a principal engineer at Meridian, which, for context, is one of our competitors, and you were apparently one of their better people. You filed 4 patents, including one on the exact type of relay circuit that just took down our most critical production line. And you came to work for us as a maintenance technician." She paused. "Why?" The room was quiet. Outside, a phone rang somewhere down the hall and was answered. "Because it's what fit," he said. "Fit for what?" "For what I needed at the time." He looked at his hands for a moment. "My wife died. Sophie was 18 months old. I had a career that required 60, 70 hours a week, constant travel, the kind of job where you're always on because the problems don't observe business hours. I couldn't do that and be the parent she needed." He paused. "So I made a choice." Olivia listened without filling the silence. "Night shift maintenance fits," he said. "I'm here while she's asleep. I'm home before school. I pick her up at 3. The problems I solve on this job, they're real problems. They matter. And when my shift ends, they stay here. I don't take them home with me." He looked up. "I know how that sounds." "It doesn't sound like anything bad," she said. "It sounds like waste. To most people. Not to me." She said it simply, without decoration. "But I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest even if the honest answer is complicated." "All right. Tuesday night. You knew what was wrong with that machine. You knew before the engineers finished their first diagnostic run, probably. And you waited 24 hours before you said anything substantial." She watched him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. It was the question he'd been carrying since he'd walked off that floor. "I tried," he said. "Early on, I mentioned the temperature reading issue to the engineering team. Webb—" He stopped. He wasn't dismissive exactly. He just moved on, and I thought, okay, they're running their process. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's a fault I haven't seen. "But you didn't think you were missing something?" "No," he said. "Not really." "So why didn't you push harder?" He looked out the window again. The honest answer was layered enough that he had to think about which layer was most true. "Because I've been on both sides of that table," he said finally. "I've been the engineer who thought the maintenance guy didn't know what he was talking about. I'm not proud of that, but I know how it goes. You hear the uniform, not the words. And when you're in the middle of a high-pressure situation and someone outside your chain of expertise says something that contradicts your analysis," he paused, "you listen or you don't. And most of the time you don't. And pushing harder doesn't change that. It just creates conflict and makes everyone dig in. So you waited for a moment when being heard was actually possible." "I waited for you," he said. Not dramatically, just precisely. "When you came over and asked me directly, that was different. You were actually asking." Olivia sat back in her chair. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than her usual directness. "You know what I keep coming back to?" she said. "You have a patent on the relay circuit architecture that failed. You were probably the single most qualified person in that building to diagnose the fault. And you were standing near the wall with your coffee." "I was doing my job," he said. "That's not what I mean." She leaned forward. "I mean, do you know how much it cost us to not know who you were? Not just this week, the 2.5 years before this week." He didn't have a ready answer for that. He hadn't thought about it from that angle. "I don't expect you to feel bad about the choices you made," she said. "They sound like the right choices. For Sophie, for your life. I'm not questioning any of that. What I'm questioning is what comes next." She paused. "If you're willing to have that conversation." He looked at her steadily. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I offer you a different role and you tell me honestly what you think about it." She folded her hands on the desk. I want you working on our engineering team. Not maintenance. Not technically adjacent to engineering. Actually on it. I want you consulting on systems problems, reviewing technical documentation, mentoring the junior engineers. She watched him carefully. I know that's not what you came here for. I know your situation is specific, and I know what you said about the hours. So I'm offering something that doesn't require 60 hours a week or travel or being constantly on. I want to build a role that works within the actual shape of your life. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. The question caught her slightly off guard. Not the word, the flatness of it, the genuine curiosity. He wasn't being contrarian. He actually wanted to understand her motivation. Because we almost replaced a machine that didn't need replacing, she said. Because our engineers didn't have access to the knowledge that was already in this building. Because Marcus Webb is smart, and he's going to be a very good engineer someday, and he spent 30 hours missing a fault that you found in 2 minutes. Not because he's incompetent, but because he didn't know what he didn't know. And you do. You have a body of knowledge and experience that our team doesn't have, and I think that's worth, I know that's worth more than what I've been paying you. He was quiet for a while, long enough that she let the silence stand. I'd need to know about the hours, he said. We'll define them, in the offer, in the contract. Whatever you need to be there for, Sophie, stays non-negotiable. I'm not interested in the title, he said. That's fine. Or He stopped. I'm not good at being managed by people who know less than I do. That sounds arrogant. I don't mean it arrogantly. I mean, I've seen it go wrong before, and I'd want to be clear about the reporting structure. That's a reasonable ask, she said. You'd report to me. He looked at her. Directly, she said. I'll be honest with you. I'm making this up as I go. I don't have a formal role description written. I'm starting with what I know. You found a fault that almost cost this company $1 million and 8 weeks of downtime, and you have knowledge and experience that our team clearly doesn't, and I want that in a room where it can actually be heard. She paused. Everything else we figure out. He sat with that. He looked at the dead plant in the corner. He wondered briefly whether she'd killed it through neglect or overwatering. Overwatering seemed more likely, given her energy. I want to think about it, he said. Of course. It's not a no. I didn't take it as one. He stood. She stood. He shook her hand, same as the first time on the floor, her hand firm and her grip direct. She walked him to the door of the office. One more thing, he said, pausing in the doorway. Yeah? The relay, he said. The oxidation pattern I found. It's a failure mode that the design documentation for this machine doesn't identify. It's in the operating conditions chapter. The guidance on humidity thresholds is out of date. The machine was designed for a facility environment that's drier than this plant runs in fall. If you don't update the maintenance protocol, you'll have the same fault again in 18 months. She looked at him. I'll write up the recommendation, he said. I'll leave it with Marco. You don't have to make any decisions about anything else to use it. He left. She stood in her doorway and watched him go down the hall. Unhurried, the same deliberate walk she'd noticed on the plant floor, the walk of someone who had learned not to hurry toward things. He turned the corner and was gone. She went back to her desk. She moved 3 things to the top of her priority list. She started drafting a role description that she wasn't sure yet how to write, for a person she wasn't sure yet how to categorize, and she did it the way she always did things she wasn't sure about. She started with what she knew was true and worked outward from there. What she knew was true was this. Daniel Brooks had been in her building for 2.5 years. He'd fixed things. He'd gone home. And in all that time, nobody had sat down with him in a room and actually asked. That was on her. She knew it. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She wrote that down, not in the role description, but in the small notebook she kept for herself, the one that wasn't a professional document and wasn't meant for anyone else. She wrote, "The most expensive thing we do is not ask the people already in the room." She looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to work. The maintenance report Daniel had promised materialized in Marco Reyes's inbox the following morning. 2 pages, single-spaced, written with the kind of technical precision that Marco, who had a solid working knowledge of the plant systems and knew his own limitations clearly enough to respect expertise when he encountered it, recognized immediately as being well above his pay grade. Not in a condescending way, just thorough. The kind of thorough that came from someone who had thought about a problem from every angle before writing a single word. Marco read it twice, then he forwarded it to Hendricks with a note that said only, "From Brooks. Night shift maintenance. Thought you should see this." Hendricks read it at his desk, standing up, the way he read things when he didn't want to commit to sitting down for them. He got halfway through and then went back to the beginning and read it again from the start. The report documented the oxidation failure mode with a specificity that the machine's own technical manual didn't come close to matching. Environmental thresholds, load conditions, the specific humidity-temperature interaction that had pushed the relay contact resistance past its functional limit. It cited 3 separate academic papers on oxide layer formation in copper relay contacts. It included a revised maintenance protocol with recommended inspection intervals and a simple cleaning procedure that any competent technician could perform in under 15 minutes. At the bottom, under a section labeled Additional Recommendations, Daniel had noted that the same failure risk existed on assembly lines 4 and 9, which used an identical relay component in comparable circuit positions, and suggested they be inspected before the next high-load production run. Hendricks put the report down. He looked at the wall for a moment, then he picked up his phone and called the manufacturer's service center in Cleveland and asked, in the careful language of a man who had been doing this for 22 years, whether they had documentation on oxidation-related relay failures in their Line 7 model under high humidity operating conditions. There was a pause on the other end. Then the service representative said he'd have to check with their technical documentation team and get back to him. He got back to him 4 hours later. The answer, delivered in the careful non-language of corporate technical support, essentially confirmed that yes, there was a known failure mode in that relay configuration under specific environmental conditions, and yes, it was not adequately documented in the standard operating manual distributed to customers. And yes, an internal service bulletin had been issued to their own technical teams 18 months ago. And no, that bulletin had not been forwarded to plant operators. Hendricks listened to all of this. He said thank you. He hung up. He sat in his chair for a long time. Then he wrote an email to Patrick Crane, copying Olivia, with a subject line that read, RE, Line 7. Incident, follow-up technical review. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs long and summarized the manufacturer's confirmation and the contents of Daniel's report. In the 3rd paragraph, written in the same careful, documentation-focused language he used for everything, he noted that the maintenance technician's analysis had been comprehensive and technically accurate and had identified a systemic risk that, left unaddressed, would likely have caused a repeat failure within the year. He did not, in the email, address the question of why that same maintenance technician had been standing near a wall for 33 hours while the engineering team worked around him. He knew the answer to that question. He wasn't ready to write it in an email. Olivia read the email on her phone in the parking lot of Sophie's school. That was where Daniel was too, she realized. Not that she knew that, but it was 3:15 on a Thursday, and that was where he'd said he was at 3 o'clock. She was there for a site visit that had been on her calendar for 2 weeks, a community relations initiative she'd committed to before any of this week had happened, and she stood in the parking lot reading Hendricks's email and thought about the distance between what people knew and what they said. The manufacturer had an internal bulletin, 18 months ago. They'd sent a crew to Columbus to diagnose a fault caused by a failure mode they already knew about, and they hadn't mentioned it once. She forwarded the email to her legal team with a 1-line note. Please review for contract implications. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went inside. The site visit was at an elementary school 3 miles from the plant, part of a STEM outreach program Ridgeway had been funding for 2 years. She'd been to 2 of these before. She knew the drill. Tour the classrooms, meet the teachers, let herself be photographed with kids doing science experiments, say the right things about community investment and workforce development. She was good at it. She genuinely believed in the program. Those 2 things were not in contradiction. What she hadn't expected was to walk into Mrs. Paulson's 2nd grade classroom and find a 7-year-old at the back of the room, completely absorbed in taking apart a small electric motor that Mrs. Paulson had apparently provided for exactly this purpose, her hair in two uneven braids that suggested her father had done them with good intentions and mixed results. The class was working on a project about simple machines. Most of the kids were engaged in varying degrees, some enthusiastic, some performing enthusiasm for the visitors, a couple clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But the girl at the back table was somewhere else entirely. She had the motor's housing open, the internal components spread carefully in front of her on a paper towel, and she was examining the copper windings with an expression of focused concentration that Olivia recognized immediately and from a very specific context. She'd seen that expression 3 days ago, on a factory floor, on a man standing near a wall. Olivia drifted toward the back of the room while Mrs. Paulson continued the tour introduction. She stopped at the table. The girl looked up. "Hi," Olivia said. "Hi." Not shy, not performing, just direct. "Do you know what this is?" She held up a small component, a brush assembly, from the look of it. "It's part of the motor," Olivia said. "A brush assembly." The girl looked at her with a slight recalibration, the expression of someone who had asked a test question and received a passing answer. "It's how the electricity gets to the spinning part," she said. "My dad showed me." Something in Olivia's chest did a small, complicated thing. "Your dad knows about motors?" "My dad knows about everything," Sophie Brooks said, with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old who had not yet discovered that this was not precisely true, though in this particular case it was closer to accurate than most. "He fixes machines, big ones." "Does he?" "He worked all night this week. He was really tired." She turned the brush assembly over in her fingers, examining it. "He says the machines tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen." She set the component down. "I don't really know what that means yet." "I think it means you pay attention," Olivia said. "To the details. The small things." Sophie considered this. "Like the brushes." "Like the brushes." The girl nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her examination. Olivia stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a site visit. Then Mrs. Paulson was at her elbow, guiding her toward the next table, and she went. She didn't say anything to the teacher about who the girl's father was. It wasn't her information to share, but she thought about it for the rest of the visit, and she thought about it on the drive back to the plant. And she thought about it when she sat down at her desk and pulled up the draft role description she'd been working on. The description was still rough. She'd been struggling with it, not with what she wanted Daniel to do, but with how to frame it in a way that was honest about the situation. She'd written and deleted 3 opening paragraphs. The problem was that every version she wrote sounded either like she was doing him a favor or like she was correcting an oversight she was embarrassed about, and neither of those was quite right. Both of those things were true, but neither was the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to put in a role description. She opened a new document. She wrote, "What this role is and what it isn't." And then she wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, the way she wrote when she was trying to figure something out rather than communicate something already figured out. At the end of 20 minutes, she had 3 paragraphs that were too honest to put in a formal document, and also, she thought, closer to true than anything she'd written so far. She saved the document. She set it aside. She went back to the formal version. She'd figure it out. Meanwhile, on lines 4 and 9, technicians spent Thursday afternoon pulling the secondary voltage relay from each machine and inspecting the contact surfaces under magnification, following the protocol Daniel had written. Line 4 came back clean. The component was within acceptable parameters, no oxidation visible. Line 9 was a different story. The relay on line 9 showed early-stage oxidation, not yet at the threshold that would cause a fault, but progressing in the direction of one. The technician who found it, a man named Carl Briggs, who'd been with the plant for 4 years and had a stolid, unglamorous competence that made him excellent at his job, documented the finding carefully, cleaned the contact surface, reinstalled the component, and flagged it for a follow-up inspection in 60 days. He noted in his report that he was following a protocol developed by D. Brooks, night shift. Line 9 kept running. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody sent an email. But somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of industrial operations, a potential 33-hour shutdown and a possible 6-figure repair had just been avoided by a piece of paper that 2 days ago hadn't existed. That was how most of the important things worked, Daniel had always thought. Not with drama, just prevention. The crisis that didn't happen because someone looked at the right thing at the right time. He was on line 2 when Carl Briggs found the line 9 relay. He didn't know about it until the next morning when Marco mentioned it in passing, and his reaction was a single nod and a note in his own log. He didn't feel satisfied exactly. More like, that's what the report was for. That's the point. He was thinking about the meeting with Olivia. He was trying not to think about the meeting with Olivia, which amounted to the same thing, expressed differently. Helen called him that evening while Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Daniel went into the hallway and talked quietly, the way he always talked when he didn't want Sophie to hear the texture of a conversation, even if she couldn't make out the words. "Patrick Crane's office called you?" Helen said. "The operations director?" "Olivia Hart, actually. I met with her Thursday afternoon." A pause. "The CEO?" "Yes." "Of the company you work for?" "Yes, Helen." "Daniel." Another pause, longer. "What did she want?" He leaned against the hallway wall. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Sophie bent over her homework, tongue slightly out, the pencil gripped with extreme intensity, the way she'd gripped things since she was a baby, like letting go was not an option. "She offered me a different position, technical advisor, something like that, working with the engineering team." The silence had a quality. "She knows about Meridian?" Helen asked. "She pulled my full file." "And she knows about the patents?" "She mentioned them." Helen was quiet for 3 seconds exactly, which was the amount of time it took her to arrive at what she thought and decide to say it. "Good," she said. "Helen, don't tell me you're thinking about saying no." "I didn't say that." "You have your careful voice on, the one you use when you've already decided something and you don't want to be talked out of it because you're not sure it's the right decision." He considered arguing with this. He decided not to. "It would mean changing things," he said. "The schedule, the routine." She said it wouldn't impact Sophie's pickup. She said we'd define it, in the contract. "So she's not asking you to go back to 60-hour weeks?" "She says not." "Then what's the problem?" He didn't answer immediately. The problem wasn't something he could put in a sentence without it sounding like something it wasn't. The problem was that he'd built a very specific life around very specific walls, and the walls had done what walls are supposed to do, which is keep things out, and he wasn't entirely sure which things she was talking about letting back in. "I'd be visible again," he said. He hadn't meant to say it quite that directly. Helen was quiet. "I'd have to—" He stopped. "It's different when your name is on things. When people know who you are. When they expect things from you." "People expected things from you at Meridian," Helen said carefully. "That wasn't the problem. The problem at Meridian was that Claire was sick, and you didn't know it yet, and you were working 70 hours a week, and then she was gone, and you were alone with a baby, and you needed—" She stopped. "You needed to stop. You needed something that was just yours and Sophie's. I understand that. I've always understood that. But Daniel—" Her voice softened slightly, just slightly, the edge under it. "Sophie is 7. She's going to be okay if her dad is known for something." He didn't say anything. "She's taking apart motors in her second-grade classroom," Helen said. "She's okay." In the kitchen, Sophie looked up from her homework, caught his eye through the doorway, and held up her pencil with an expression that communicated something between triumph and exasperation. He held up a finger, 1 minute, and she sighed elaborately and went back to work. "I know," he said. "So what do you need to figure out?" The honest answer was that he didn't know yet. The honest answer was that what Olivia had said, what comes next, had been sitting in the back of his mind like a piece of code he hadn't finished running, looping through variables he hadn't yet fully identified. "I'll figure it out," he said. Helen made the sound she made when she thought he was being oblique on purpose. "Call me when you have." "Yeah." "And Daniel," what she said, "about the role. Does it sound like real work? Things you'd actually be doing that matter?" He thought about the relay, about lines 4 and 9, about the maintenance protocol he'd written in 45 minutes the morning after his shift, the kind of technical writing he'd spent years doing at Meridian, that he'd told himself he didn't miss and wasn't sure that was true. About Webb and his team spending 30 hours running diagnostics on a fault they didn't have the framework to find. About what it would mean to give them that framework. Yeah, he said. It sounds like real work. Okay, Helen said. Then that's the question, isn't it? Not whether it's safe. Whether it's real. He looked at the ceiling of his hallway. You've been waiting to say that. Since Tuesday, yeah. He almost laughed. Good night, Helen. Night. He went back to the kitchen. Sophie had finished her homework and was now drawing something on the back of her worksheet. The focused intensity of the homework replaced with the looser, more satisfied focus of a person doing something they'd chosen. He sat down across from her. What are you drawing? The motor, she said. From school. I'm trying to remember all the parts. He looked at the drawing. It was rough. She was 7. But the basic structure was there. She'd labeled some of the components in her careful block letter handwriting, misspelling winding as winding, which was actually correct, and armature as armature, which was not, but was a reasonable attempt. This part, he said, pointing. What does it do? She leaned over to look. It's the thing that spins. The rotor, he said. And what makes it spin? The electricity goes through. She frowned. Through the brushes, and then it makes a... She waved her hand. A push and a pull thing. Magnetic field, he said. The current in the rotor creates a magnetic field that interacts with the fixed magnets in the housing, and the interaction between them creates a rotational force. She looked at him. You should explain it more like Mrs. Paulson. How does Mrs. Paulson explain it? She says it's like the magnets are arguing, and the only way to resolve it is to keep spinning. She said this with the satisfaction of someone who had found a genuinely useful metaphor. I like that. He thought about it. That's actually pretty accurate. I know. Sophie looked at her drawing. Dad, what's your job going to be now? He looked at her. What do you mean? Helen told me. She said it simply, without guile. Helen had apparently been less careful than he'd thought. She said someone at your work found out you know a lot about machines. He took a breath. She told you that? She said you might do a different job, a bigger one. Would that be okay with you? Sophie considered this with the seriousness that she applied to genuinely important questions, as distinct from the performance of seriousness she applied to things she'd already decided about. Would you still pick me up at 3? That would be non-negotiable, he said. He'd used that word with Olivia, and he was aware, saying it to Sophie, that it had come from the same place both times. Okay, she said. She went back to her drawing. Then it's fine. He looked at her for a moment. The drawing of the motor, the labels in careful block letters, the motor from the classroom that Mrs. Paulson had let her take apart because she'd asked, and Mrs. Paulson was the kind of teacher who said yes to questions like that. The machines tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. He'd said that to her when she was 5, and she'd repeated it back to him tonight as if she understood it, and maybe she did, in the way that 7-year-olds understand things. Not completely, not with the full weight of context, but with the essential truth intact. He called Olivia's office the next morning and left a message saying he'd like to continue the conversation about the role. The message he got back, through Patrick, was brief. Good. She'll have something concrete to discuss by end of next week. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. He kept doing what he was doing. What he was doing, in the practical sense, was his job. The same job he'd been doing for 2.5 years. The night shift maintenance rounds, the sensor checks and seal inspections, and the 1,000 small adjustments that kept a plant running without drama. But something had shifted in the texture of it quietly, without announcement. The maintenance report he'd written had circulated through the engineering team, and the engineers now knew his name in a different way than they had before. Not just the maintenance guy. Something harder to categorize. Webb was the most visible example of this shift, because Webb was the most visible engineer and because Webb had the kind of personality that processed new information loudly through expression and behavior rather than quietly. He came to the floor on Friday morning on a walkthrough with 2 junior engineers, ostensibly reviewing the Line 7 repair documentation, and he stopped near the main panel and looked at the restored system running clean, And then he looked around the floor as if looking for something, and his eyes landed on Daniel, who was nearby working a connector on the secondary conveyor, and Webb walked over. Daniel saw him coming and said nothing. He kept working. Webb stood there for a moment. "The report you filed," he said, "the oxidation protocol." "Yeah?" "I read it." "Okay. You cited the Hartman paper, the 2019 one on copper oxide formation rates in variable humidity environments." Daniel looked up from the connector. "You know it?" "I know of it. I haven't read it. It's not in our standard reference materials." A pause. "I didn't know that failure mode existed." Daniel looked at him steadily. "The machine's own manual doesn't cover it well. The environmental threshold section is based on a drier facility environment than what we run here in fall." "How did you know to look there?" "I've seen it before," Daniel said. He went back to the connector. Different machine, different manufacturer, same physics. Webb was quiet for a moment. The junior engineers had stopped a few feet back, following the conversation with the careful attention of people who understood they were watching something but weren't sure what. "I should have listened on Tuesday morning," Webb said. Daniel looked up again. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected it, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with it, which was its own kind of honest. "You were busy," he said. "That's not—" Webb stopped, restarted. "That's not why. And you know that's not why." He said it without making a production of it. Direct. Slightly uncomfortable, but direct. Daniel held the connector in his hands. He thought about 33 hours. He thought about the relay in his pocket the first night. The glimpse of oxidation under his flashlight. The decision not to say anything yet. He thought about Webb's dismissal on Tuesday morning, and the specific way a person learns to hear dismissal so often that they almost stop noticing it. "No," he said. "It's not." Webb nodded, a single nod. "I'm going to read the Hartman paper," he said. "There's a 2021 follow-up that's more directly applicable," Daniel said. "Covers high humidity environment specifically. I can send you the citation." Something in Webb's expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it that was less comfortable than gratitude and therefore probably more real. "Yeah," he said. "That'd be good." He went back to his walkthrough. Daniel went back to the connector. The junior engineers exchanged a glance that communicated something between confusion and the dawning awareness that they'd witnessed something they'd need to process later. The floor kept running. Over the next week, the shift was gradual but real. It didn't transform anything overnight. This wasn't that kind of story. The engineers didn't suddenly start asking maintenance technicians for their opinions on complex systems problems. The hierarchy didn't dissolve. The culture didn't change because one machine got fixed and one person's name got recognized. But small things happened. Carl Briggs, emboldened by finding the Line 9 relay, pulled and inspected the equivalent components on 2 other machines he'd been meaning to look at for months. Found nothing concerning, documented it anyway. Good practice, now that there was a protocol to follow. One of the junior engineers, a 24-year-old named Priya Sandhu, who had been with the company for 8 months and was visibly, slightly terrified of Webb in the way that junior people sometimes were of confident senior people, showed up on the floor one afternoon and asked Marco if it would be okay if she asked the night shift maintenance team some questions about the secondary circuit behavior they observed during normal operations. Stuff the diagnostic software didn't capture. Stuff that lived in the hands-on knowledge of people who worked the machines every day. Marco said he didn't see why not. She started staying an extra hour 2 evenings a week, a notebook in hand, talking to the night shift technicians. She was careful about it, not demanding, not taking their time for granted. She brought coffee. She listened more than she talked. After the 3rd session, she stopped by Daniel's workstation. He was documenting a routine check. She stood nearby with the slightly tentative energy of someone who had a question they weren't sure was welcome. "The line behavior you described," she said, "the way the conveyor speed fluctuates by about 0.3% under high-load conditions. Is that consistent across all 3 lines or just line 7? He looked at her. "Why?" "I'm trying to model the load distribution pattern. There's a vibration signature that our sensors are picking up that I think might be related to the speed fluctuation. but I need to know if it's systemic or localized. What vibration frequency? She told him. He thought about it. Lines 7 and 4, not line 9. Line 9's drive motor was replaced about 8 months ago. Newer model, slightly different torque curve. She wrote something down. That would explain the difference in the vibration data. She looked up. Can I ask you more about this later? I don't want to take up your time right now. Come back on Wednesday, he said. I'm doing a full inspection of the drive systems that night. You can watch how it runs under different load conditions. She said thank you with a specificity that suggested she meant it. She went back upstairs. Daniel finished his documentation. He thought about Priya Sandhu asking the right question, and about the fact that she'd asked it of a maintenance technician, and about what that said about her. Not just professionally, but as a person. That she'd been paying attention. That she'd had the sense to look for knowledge where it actually lived. He thought about what it had cost the company, and what it had almost cost the company, that nobody had thought to do that sooner. He thought about Olivia's notebook. He hadn't seen it, obviously, but he knew about it the way you know about things sometimes. From the fact of how she operated, the directness of her thinking, the way she listened. The kind of person who wrote things down for herself, not for records, not for documentation. He thought about what the role description might look like when Patrick brought it to him next week. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought about whether he was ready for what it would mean to be visible again. To have his name attached to things. To have people looking at him expecting something specific. He thought about Sophie and the motor drawing. The magnets arguing. The only way to resolve it is to keep spinning. He wasn't ready in the way that you're ready for something you've prepared for and feel confident about. He was ready in the different way. The way you're ready for something because you've been moving toward it slowly, without fully acknowledging it, for longer than you realized. The floor was loud around him. The machines were doing what machines did. He picked up his tools and moved to the next inspection point on his list. He had work to do. The role description arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the night line 7 went silent, almost to the hour. Patrick brought it in person, the way Olivia had asked him to do for anything involving Daniel. 2 pages, printed, no corporate letterhead. Olivia had decided against the formal HR template after 3 attempts at it, and what Patrick handed Daniel in the break room at 4:50 in the afternoon, 10 minutes before his shift started, was something that read more like a letter than a job posting. Direct sentences. Specific expectations. No language about synergizing cross-functional competencies, or leveraging stakeholder relationships, or any of the other vocabulary that accumulated in formal documents like sediment at the bottom of a river. Daniel read it standing at the break room table. Patrick sat across from him with a coffee he wasn't drinking, watching him read with the careful neutrality of a man who had been given no instructions about how to handle whatever reaction he got. The title was simple: Special Technical Advisor, Systems and Engineering. The reporting structure was as Olivia had said, directly to her, with a formal liaison relationship to the engineering department. The scope was broad. Consult on systems failures and diagnostic challenges. Review technical documentation for accuracy against real operating conditions. Assist in developing maintenance and inspection protocols. Available for engineering team consultation on complex problems. The hours section was half a page long. That was unusual for a role description, and Daniel noticed it immediately. It specified a base commitment of 25 hours per week, with flexibility on scheduling to be agreed between Daniel and Olivia directly. It explicitly stated that response outside of agreed hours was not expected, and that the role did not carry an on-call requirement. There was a sentence that read, "This role is designed to fit within the constraints of the advisor's existing commitments, and those constraints are considered non-negotiable by the organization." That sentence had Olivia's voice in it so clearly that Daniel could almost hear her saying it. The compensation was at the bottom. He read the number. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at it again. "That's not a mistake?" he said. "No," Patrick said. "That's—" He stopped. "It reflects the market rate for a principal-level systems engineering consultant," Patrick said, "with a slight premium because you're not going anywhere." Daniel set the pages down on the table. He looked at the wall. The break room had a motivational poster on it that someone had defaced with a marker years ago so that it now read, "There is no I in team, but there is a ME if you rearrange it, which Daniel had always found more honest than the original. "What does she need from me before the Fletcher inspection?" he asked. Patrick looked at him. "That's your question?" "That's my first question." A pause. "She needs the plant running clean and the engineering team confident," Patrick said. "The Fletcher people are going to walk the floor. They're going to talk to the supervisors. They're going to ask technical questions about the systems, and she needs people who can answer them without hesitating." "How much do the engineering team know about the Fletcher inspection?" "They know it's happening. They know the contract size. They know the stakes." "Does Webb know what Fletcher will specifically be looking at?" Patrick reached into the folder he'd brought and slid another document across the table. "Inspection protocol. Marcus Elmwood, Fletcher's VP of Procurement, sent it over last week. He's thorough." Daniel picked it up and read it. He read it for longer than he'd read the role description. Patrick waited. "Elmwood's going to ask about redundancy systems," Daniel said without looking up. "He's got 3 items here about failover protocols and backup system architecture. That's specific. That's someone who's been burned before by a supplier whose primary systems failed and whose backup systems failed at the same time." "We've had that conversation internally," Patrick said carefully. "Our redundancy documentation is in order." Daniel looked up. "Is the documentation in order, or are the systems in order?" Patrick held his gaze. "What's the difference?" "The difference is whether you've tested the failover under realistic conditions or whether you've documented that the failover exists." He set the inspection protocol down. "Those are 2 different things, and someone who's been burned before will know which one he's looking at." The break room was quiet. Somewhere in the plant, a machine cycled through its startup sequence. The distant sound of hydraulics engaging, the shift in ambient pressure that people who worked here long enough stopped noticing consciously. "Have you tested the failover systems recently?" Daniel asked. "Last certified test was 14 months ago." 14 months. "It's within the compliance window." "Elmwood doesn't care about the compliance window," Daniel said. "He cares about whether it works." Patrick looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his untouched coffee and finally drank some of it. "What would you need?" "A week," Daniel said, "and access to the full redundancy system documentation, and someone from the engineering team who knows those systems well enough to run the tests with me. Webb, if he's willing." Patrick almost said something. Then he recalibrated. "I'll talk to him." He paused. "Does this mean you're taking the role?" Daniel looked at the 2 pages still on the table, the letter that was a job description, the sentence about non-negotiable constraints, the number at the bottom that he was still, at some level, not entirely sure was real. "I'll sign it tomorrow," he said. "Bring me a pen." Patrick nodded. He gathered his folder. He stood up, and Daniel thought he was going to say something about what this meant, or what the company owed him, or one of the other things that people said at moments that had the shape of significance. Instead, Patrick just said, 6 o'clock tomorrow, before your shift, and went out. Daniel sat alone in the break room for a moment. The motivational poster watched him from the wall. He thought about Meridian, about the office with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the team of 12 and the patents that had his name on them and the feeling of walking into a building where people knew exactly who he was. He thought for a while after Claire died that losing that was the punishment, that he'd somehow gotten something he didn't deserve, and that the universe had corrected the imbalance. He'd learned, slowly, that wasn't how it worked. Things didn't happen for reasons. They just happened, and then you made choices inside what happened, and the choices were yours. He picked up the role description. He folded it carefully, the way he folded things he intended to keep, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went to work. He found Webb at the engineering station at 7:15 that same night, running data from the day's production cycle. Webb looked up when Daniel came in. There was still a slight adjustment in his expression when Daniel appeared somewhere unexpected, the recalibration of someone updating a mental category, but it was faster now, less visible. "Patrick said you might stop by," Webb said. "Fletcher inspection is in 9 days," Daniel said. "Elmwood is going to focus on redundancy systems." Webb leaned back in his chair. "I saw the inspection protocol. When was the last time we did a full failover test under load?" A pause. Not a long one, but present. 14 months. "I want to run a live test. Full failover sequence on line 7, under operating load conditions, timed and documented. He looked at Webb steadily. If there's a problem, I'd rather find it now. Webb looked at him. And if there's a problem? Then we fix it before Elmwood walks through that door. Something moved through Webb's expression. Not quite relief, but the thing adjacent to relief that happens when someone articulates out loud the thing you've been not quite thinking about. Line 7's primary control unit was restored after the relay fix, he said. The redundancy system hasn't been touched. Theoretically clean. Theoretically. Yeah. Webb looked at his screen, then back. When do you want to do the test? Thursday night, late, after the production run is down for maintenance window. I need 4 hours. I'll be here. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Webb said it without edge. I want to see how it runs. A pause. And I want to know if there's a problem before Elmwood does. Daniel nodded. He started to leave. At the door, Webb said, without looking up from his screen, Patrick told me about the role. Daniel stopped. Technical advisor, Webb said, reporting to Hart. He was quiet for a moment. That's a good call on her part. It was the kind of thing that cost something to say, Daniel knew. Not much, but something. He didn't make Webb pay more for it than it was worth. Thursday, he said, 11 p.m. He left. The week before the Fletcher inspection had the particular compressed intensity of a period where multiple things that have been building slowly arrive at the same time. Olivia was running on a schedule that Patrick described, with his characteristic understatement, as challenging. She had board calls, contract prep meetings, a facilities review, and a last-minute request from the Fletcher team to provide additional documentation on their quality control systems, a request that came in on Wednesday evening and needed to be responded to by Friday morning and required 4 people to work late. She signed Daniel's contract on Wednesday morning. She'd had a copy for herself, and she filed it in her desk drawer rather than the HR system, which she knew was slightly irregular and didn't care about. Some things were worth keeping in arm's reach. She asked Patrick to let Daniel know that she appreciated his moving quickly. Patrick passed it along. Daniel said thanks. That exchange, abbreviated and practical, was somehow exactly right for both of them. On Thursday night, at 11 o'clock, Daniel and Webb ran the failover test on line 7. It did not go well. Not catastrophically. The system didn't fail completely, nothing crashed, nobody was in danger. But when they initiated the failover sequence, cutting power to the primary control unit and allowing the redundancy system to assume control of the line, the transition took 11 seconds. It was supposed to take 3. The safety protocol required it to complete within 5. And during those 11 seconds, the line ran without full sensor coverage, which meant it ran without thermal protection, without load monitoring, without the interlocks that prevented the robotic arms from moving into positions they weren't supposed to occupy. 11 seconds in a normal operating environment was probably fine. In a worst-case scenario, 11 seconds was long enough for something to go wrong in ways that were expensive and possibly dangerous. Webb stood at the monitoring station watching the data come in with an expression that Daniel had not seen on him before. Not the controlled competence of a senior engineer, not the slight edge of someone used to being the smartest person in a meeting. Just a person looking at a number that was worse than expected, processing what that meant. 8 seconds over threshold, he said. Yeah. Elmwood is going to test this. Almost certainly. If he runs it and gets 11 seconds, he walks, Daniel said, or he uses it as a leverage point to kill the contract. Either way, Webb ran a hand through his hair. What's causing the delay? Daniel was already looking at the failover sequence log on the secondary terminal. The handshake protocol between the primary and redundancy control units. There's a verification loop that's running too many cycles before the redundancy system assumes full authority. It's a software configuration issue. Can we fix it before Tuesday? Yes, Daniel said, but I need someone who knows the control software. The failover logic is in the PLC configuration. I know the hardware, but the software side needs someone who's worked in that system before. Webb nodded immediately. Priya, he said. Priya Sandhu. She did her graduate thesis on PLC optimization. He was already reaching for his phone. She's going to love this. It's 11:30 at night. She's still here. Webb said it with the certainty of someone who knew his team. She's always here on Thursdays. I think she's running vibration analysis data. He was already typing. I'll get her. He texted. 40 seconds later, his phone buzzed. He looked at it. She says, give her 10 minutes. Daniel looked at the failover log. 11 seconds. He walked the sequence back through his head, identifying the verification loop, mapping the logic. When Priya arrived, slightly out of breath, notebook already open, the particular energy of someone who had been doing something absorbing and was now being asked to do something different and absorbing. He walked her through what they'd found in about 3 minutes. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise. Then she sat down at the terminal and started working. Webb stood behind her, watching. Daniel stood beside him. The break room down the hall smelled like someone's reheated dinner. The plant was quiet outside, just the background hum of systems in standby. At 12:45, Priya looked up. Okay, she said. The verification loop is running a 12-step handshake when it only needs 7. The extra steps were added in a software update 8 months ago. I think it was a security patch, and whoever configured it didn't optimize the failover logic afterward. She looked at Daniel. If I modify the PLC configuration to streamline the handshake, we should get the transition time down significantly, but I want to test it before I commit the change, and I want to run it 3 times to make sure the result is consistent. Do it, Daniel said. If I get this wrong, you won't get it wrong, Webb said. He said it not as reassurance, but as assessment. Priya looked at him for a moment, then nodded and went back to work. She ran the first test at 1:15. Transition time, 4.8 seconds. Within threshold, barely, but within. She ran it again, 4.6. A third time, 4.7. The 3 of them looked at the numbers. Consistent, Priya said, and improving slightly as the system settles into the new configuration. Document everything, Daniel said. Every step of the modification, every test result, time-stamped. Elmwood is going to want to see the paper trail. Already started, she said, and turned her notebook toward him. She'd been writing as she worked. The documentation was neat, organized, complete. He looked at it. He thought about himself at her age, running tests at Meridian in the early hours of the morning, the specific satisfaction of a problem moving from wrong to right under your hands. He thought about what she'd said to him on the floor earlier in the week, the precision of her question about vibration frequency, the notebook she'd brought. Good work, he said. It was a simple thing. It was the thing it was meant to be. Priya closed her notebook. You want me to run a full diagnostic on the redundancy system tomorrow? Make sure there aren't other configuration issues from that same patch? Yeah, Daniel said. Full sweep. Take whoever you need. She nodded. She gathered her things. At the door, she paused. Can I ask you something? Sure. The relay you found on line 7, she said. The oxidation. How did you know to look there? The diagnostic system didn't flag it. It wasn't in the standard inspection checklist. He thought about how to answer this. There were several true answers, and not all of them were equally useful. Experience, he said. I'd seen that failure pattern before. And the smell was wrong. The machine didn't smell like it had run hot, even though the reading said it had. So I went looking for what could generate a false temperature reading without creating actual heat. The smell, she said. You spend enough time with machines, you learn what they smell like when they're in trouble versus when they're pretending to be in trouble. He paused. The technical term is phenomenological diagnostic assessment, but mostly it's just paying attention. She looked at him for a moment. Is that something you can teach? He thought about it. Some of it, he said. The frameworks, yes. The pattern recognition. That takes time. But the frameworks accelerate it. He looked at her. Come back next week. We'll start on the diagnostic frameworks for secondary circuit failures. Bring your questions. She said she would. She left. Webb looked at Daniel. You're already doing the job, he said. Daniel didn't answer that directly. Get some sleep, he said. We've got a lot to do before Tuesday. Webb left at 2 in the morning. Daniel stayed until 4, running through the rest of the failover test documentation, cross-referencing it against the inspection protocol Elmwood had sent. He made a list of 7 items he wanted to verify before Tuesday morning. He sent it to Webb and Priya with a note that said, "Not urgent, but before end of day Monday would be good." He went home. He slept for 3 hours. He got up and made Sophie's lunch and walked her to school and stood at the gate until she disappeared into the building, the way he always did. And then he went home and slept for 3 more hours and got up and went back to work. Saturday and Sunday had the quality of compressed time. The feeling of a week's worth of activity fitted into 48 hours. Webb pulled in 2 additional engineers for the redundancy system review. Priya ran the full diagnostic sweep and found one more configuration issue. Minor, a logging parameter that had been set incorrectly, unlikely to cause a real-world problem, but exactly the kind of thing a thorough inspector would notice, and corrected it. Carl Briggs and 2 other maintenance techs ran inspection checks on all active lines, documenting results in a format that Daniel had laid out specifically so that it would read clearly to someone who didn't work at Ridgeway. On Sunday afternoon, Olivia came to the plant. Not for a formal review, Patrick hadn't scheduled anything. She just showed up in jeans and a pullover, which Daniel had not seen her in before. And she walked the floor the way she sometimes did on weekends when she was thinking about something and needed to think about it in the physical space where the thing lived. She found Daniel at the main panel on line 7, reviewing the updated failover documentation. He saw her coming and didn't stop what he was doing, which she appreciated. "How are we looking?" she asked. "Better than we were on Thursday night," he said. "The failover timing is corrected. Documentation is clean. We've got a full inspection log for every line, updated this weekend." "What are you worried about?" He looked at her. The question was direct enough to deserve a direct answer. Elmwood is going to walk this floor and he's going to look at everything. And at some point he's going to find something that isn't perfect, because nothing is. The question is whether what he finds is a documented known issue with a corrective action plan, or whether it's something we didn't know about. And? I think we're in the first category now. 2 weeks ago, I wasn't sure. She looked at Lena 7 running. Clean, steady, the relay contact surfaces checked and within parameters. "You started Monday," she said. "Tomorrow." "Yes." "Your first day as special technical advisor." "My first day as special technical advisor is also the day before the most important inspection this company has had in 2 years, he said. "The timing is what it is." She almost smiled. "That's one way to put it." She turned to look at him. "Are you ready for Tuesday?" He thought about this honestly. "I'm ready for what I can control. The systems are as solid as we can make them in the time we've had. Webb and Sandhu know the redundancy documentation inside out now. The maintenance logs are clean." He paused. "Elmwood is a variable. I can't make him decide anything." "No," she said. "That's my job." They stood at the panel for a moment. The machine ran between them, indifferent to the weight of what depended on it. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you for the speed of this." She gestured toward the floor. The documentation, the tests, the weekend work that had happened because he'd looked at an inspection protocol and identified where the risk lived. "I know you didn't have to move this fast." "You're paying me to move this fast now," he said. "I wasn't when you identified the failover issue Thursday night." He looked at the floor. He thought about what he was going to say and decided to say it. "The work needed doing," he said. "The inspection is Tuesday. There wasn't another option." He paused. "That's not something you need to thank me for. That's just the situation." She nodded. She didn't push it further. She understood, he thought, that gratitude sometimes made things more complicated than they needed to be, and that the right response to a person who didn't want to be thanked for doing what needed doing was to let them keep doing it. She left him to his work. Monday came in cold and gray, the kind of October morning that didn't ease into the day but arrived all at once, fully formed. Daniel dropped Sophie at school at 7:55, watched her run through the gate without looking back. She never looked back, which he had decided was a good sign about her general orientation toward the world, and drove to the plant. He signed in as special technical advisor for the first time. The receptionist looked at his name tag, which still said maintenance technician, because HR hadn't updated the system yet, and then at the sign-in sheet, and then at him, and he said, "They're working on it." And she nodded and gave him his visitor badge, which also said maintenance technician. and he thought about mentioning this and decided against it. He went to the floor. He spent the morning with Webb and 2 junior engineers running a final walkthrough of every system that appeared in Elmwood's inspection protocol. Not testing. Testing was done. This was review. Standing in front of each system, talking through it, making sure that everyone who might need to speak to it could speak to it clearly and completely and without hesitation. At one point, one of the junior engineers, a 26-year-old named Tom Garrett, who had been at Ridgeway for 6 months and was very good at running automated diagnostics and less confident in free-form technical discussion, fumbled an explanation of the redundancy failover sequence and stopped, frustrated, in the middle of a sentence. "Start from the hardware," Daniel said. "Not the sequence. What does the redundancy system physically consist of?" Tom looked at him. "Secondary control unit, separate power supply, mirrored sensor array." "Right. So when the primary goes down, the secondary takes over, but it has to verify." "Why does it have to verify?" "Because it needs to know the state of the system before it assumes control. Otherwise, it could restart a process that was mid-cycle and cause—" He stopped. He had it. "It's like taking over the wheel of a moving car. You have to know where it's going before you grab the wheel." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Use that. If Elmwood asks you to explain it, use that." Tom nodded. He looked slightly less like he was waiting to be corrected. Webb watched this exchange from 2 steps back, saying nothing. Later, after the walkthrough, he fell into step beside Daniel in the corridor. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "Finding the explanation that fits the person." He said it with a slight roughness, the way people say true things they've been slightly reluctant to say. "You gave me the Hartman paper citation. You gave Tom the car analogy. Different people, different—" He paused. "You know what I'm talking about." Communication," Daniel said. "Yeah." "It's not what I expected," Webb said. And then, before Daniel could respond, before the statement could become something more weighted than it needed to be, "That's not an insult, it's an acknowledgement." "I know," Daniel said. "Is it something you were always good at, or—" "I was terrible at it for most of my 20s, Daniel said. "I was the engineer who thought that if the technical explanation was correct, the communication was fine. It took—" He paused. He thought about Claire, who had been patient with him about this in the particular way of someone who loved you enough to tell you when you were being an ass. "It took someone who was willing to tell me I was wrong." Webb was quiet for a moment. They walked. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been wrong about a few things this week." "I know," Daniel said. "So have I." They reached the engineering station. Webb stopped. Daniel kept walking. There wasn't a dramatic pause, no meaningful look exchanged. Just 2 people who had started the week as strangers inhabiting different floors of the same building and had arrived at something that wasn't friendship yet, but was the foundation of something working. The rest of Monday was preparation and more preparation. Daniel ate a sandwich at his desk at 1:30 and realized partway through that he'd been calling it his desk in his head without noticing, which was a small thing and felt larger than it was. He called Helen at 3 to confirm she had Sophie's pickup. Helen said she did. She asked how Monday was going. He said fine. She said good, and he could hear in the word everything she wasn't saying, which was something he'd appreciated about her since they were kids, that she always gave him room to not say things until he was ready. He went back to work. At 5, Olivia called a brief meeting in the conference room. She, Patrick, Daniel, Webb, and Priya. 6 chairs, 5 people. Someone had brought a box of donuts that had been there since morning and were slightly stale, and everyone took one anyway because it was 5 in the afternoon and everyone was running on less sleep than was ideal. Olivia looked around the table. "Where are we?" she said. Not a question. An invitation. Webb went through the redundancy system status. Priya walked through the PLC configuration fix. Daniel summarized the inspection readiness of each line in 4 minutes, which he could do because he'd been walking the floor all day and had the information organized in his head in the way he organized things when he was going to need to access them quickly. Olivia listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions, each of them targeted at the specific gaps she'd identified as she listened, which was a skill Daniel was increasingly aware of. The ability to track not just what was said, but what hadn't been said yet. "Delwood," she said. "What's his style?" "He's methodical," Daniel said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't prepped an answer to this question. He'd read the inspection protocol carefully enough to have a sense of the person behind it. The protocol he sent reads like someone who's been burned by performance theater. He's not interested in the tour. He's interested in the data. He's going to ask to see raw documentation, not summaries. He's going to want to talk to the people who actually operate the systems, not just the managers. "So when he's on the floor," Olivia said. "Let him talk to the floor people," Daniel said. Don't hover. If he asks Marco something, let Marco answer it. If he wants to talk to a maintenance tech, let him." He paused. "The floor is solid. The documentation is solid. The weakest point is if he senses that the people in charge are trying to manage what he sees." Olivia looked at him. "You've dealt with people like Delwood before." "I've been Delwood before," he said. "At Meridian, I ran supplier evaluations. I was the person who walked the floor and decided whether a company was worth the contract." The room was quiet for a moment. "What made you decide yes?" Priya asked. She said it genuinely, not to fill the silence, but because she wanted to know. Daniel thought about it. "When the answer to a question I didn't expect was better than the answer to the questions I did," he said. "When something went slightly wrong during the visit and I could see how the team handled it, not perfectly, that would have told me they'd staged it, just competently, honestly." He looked around the table. "We don't need to be perfect tomorrow. We need to be real." Olivia let that sit for a moment. Then she looked at the stale donuts. "Get some sleep tonight," she said. "All of you." She stood up. "Real starts at 8 tomorrow morning." Daniel drove home in the dark. Columbus in October at 6:30, the city settling into the particular rhythm of early evening, the lights coming on in windows along the residential streets, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere. He'd always liked this hour in this city. It was unglamorous in the specific way of things that were genuinely good at being what they were, not what they wanted to seem. He picked up Sophie from Helen's. She was asleep on Helen's couch, which was unusual. She'd had a long day, Helen said quietly in the doorway, hand waving in the direction of a school project that had taken a wrong turn and required significant emotional investment to set right. Daniel looked at his daughter asleep on his sister's couch, 7 years old, one sock on and one sock inexplicably missing, and he thought about Tuesday morning and what was riding on it and how completely none of that mattered right now. He carried her to the car. She woke up halfway there, enough to say "Dad" in the blurry, automatic way of a child who wasn't really awake, and he said, "I've got you," and she went back to sleep. He got her home. He got her to bed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he always did. He went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table with the contract in his hand, the 2 pages, still folded in his shirt pocket since Thursday, slightly worn at the folds now, and he read it again. Not the compensation number this time. The sentence about non-negotiable constraints. He thought about what tomorrow would bring. He thought about Delwood walking the floor and the redundancy systems running clean at 4.7 seconds, and Priya's notebook full of careful documentation, and Webb saying, "I've been wrong about a few things this week" in the hallway, like it cost him something to say it, and he was paying it anyway. He thought about what it felt like to sit at a table with a thermos and watch people look through you, and about what it felt like to be asked. He put the contract back in his pocket. He finished his tea. He went to bed. The machines at Ridgeway Technologies ran through the night, doing what machines did, performing the patient, uninterrupted work of keeping things moving, indifferent to the human weight of what the morning would bring. Tomorrow, Marcus Delwood would arrive at 8 o'clock. Tomorrow, the floor would be what it was. Daniel slept. Marcus Delwood arrived at 7:58, not 8 o'clock. 7:58, which told Daniel something before the man had said a word. People who arrived exactly on time were being polite. People who arrived 2 minutes early were making a point, that they took the appointment seriously, that their time mattered, that they were already working while you were still getting ready. Daniel had done the same thing for years at Meridian, walking into supplier facilities with his notebook and his questions, and the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that what a place looked like before the official tour started was often more informative than anything that came after. He watched from the engineering station as Patrick met Delwood in the lobby. Delwood was 60, maybe 62, a compact man with the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where posture communicated seriousness. Gray suit, no tie, the kind of quality that didn't announce itself. He had a leather notebook under one arm and no other materials, which meant either he was extremely confident in his memory or he'd done enough preparation that he didn't need props. He had two people with him, a younger woman with a tablet, his technical analyst probably, and a man in his 40s with the specific energy of someone whose job was to look for problems. Quality assurance, Daniel guessed. A person whose professional value was measured in things he found that other people missed. Daniel recognized that person. He'd been that person. Olivia met them in the lobby. Daniel couldn't see the greeting from where he stood, but he could read the body language from 40 feet away. Elmwood direct and businesslike. Handshake that didn't linger, eyes already moving past Olivia toward the facility. Not rude. Efficient. He wasn't here for pleasantries, and he wasn't pretending otherwise, which Daniel actually respected. Marco appeared beside Daniel. "They're early," he said quietly. 2 minutes, Daniel said. "It's intentional." "Is that good or bad?" "Neither. It's just who he is." He watched Elmwood's eyes track across the visible portion of the floor from the lobby window. "He's already looking." "At what?" "Everything." Daniel picked up his coffee. "Let's go." The tour began with the administrative overview: compliance documentation, quality certifications, production records. Olivia walked Elmwood through it in the conference room while his analyst worked through the binders Patrick had prepared. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, not presenting, just present. Olivia had asked him to be there because if Elmwood asked a technical question that went past the documentation, she wanted someone in the room who could answer it without stalling. Elmwood asked 3 technical questions in the first 20 minutes. The first 2 were addressed by the documentation. The third wasn't. "Your redundancy failover documentation shows a recertification test from 14 months ago," Elmwood said, without looking up from the binder. "That's within your compliance window, but your facility runs at significantly higher ambient humidity in fall and winter than your operating specification baseline. Has the redundancy system performance been verified under current environmental conditions?" The room was quiet for a beat. Olivia looked at Daniel. Daniel leaned forward. "We ran a full live failover test under operating load conditions 6 days ago," he said. "Thursday night. The test identified a PLC configuration issue from a software update 8 months ago that had extended the failover transition time beyond our safety threshold. The issue was corrected Friday morning, and we ran 3 additional tests to confirm consistency. Current failover transition time is 4.7 seconds, within our 5-second threshold, and the documentation from both the initial test and the remediation is in your packet. Tab 4. Elmwood looked at him, not at the binder, at Daniel. "You identified the configuration issue during the test?" "Yes." "What was causing it?" "A 12-step handshake protocol in the verification loop between the primary and redundancy control units. The software update that introduced it was a security patch. The technician who configured it didn't optimize the failover logic afterward, so the redundancy system was running 5 unnecessary verification steps before assuming control authority." Elmwood looked at the woman with the tablet. She was already on tab 4 reading. She gave him a small nod. "It's there. It checks out." He looked back at Daniel. "What's your role here?" "Special Technical Advisor, Systems and Engineering, as of Monday." Something moved in Elmwood's eyes. Not quite amusement, something more like recognition. "As of Monday," he said. "And you identified a critical failover issue on Thursday." "I was in a different role on Thursday," Daniel said. "The issue needed finding, so I found it." Elmwood looked at him for another moment. Then he turned back to the binder. "Let's see the floor," he said. The floor walk took 3 hours. Elmwood moved through it the way Daniel had known he would, methodically, without hurrying, stopping at things that interested him and not explaining why they interested him. He asked to see the raw sensor logs from the previous week's production runs. He asked Marco 3 questions about shift changeover procedures and listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone who was not also planning his next question. He asked the woman running the Line 4 conveyor to walk him through what she did when a load anomaly alert came up, and listened to her whole answer, and then asked one follow-up question. And when she answered it correctly, he wrote something in his leather notebook. He stopped at line 7 for longer than any other station. He looked at the control panel. He looked at the relay access panel on the side. He looked at the maintenance log posted on the board beside the station, the running record of every inspection and repair and finding, updated to include the relay cleaning from 2 weeks ago. He read the entry. He read it twice. Secondary voltage relay, he said. Not to anyone in particular. Oxide layer on contact surface. False thermal reading. Yes, Daniel said. He was standing nearby, not hovering, just present. This was the shutdown event from... Elmwood checked his notes. 3 weeks ago. 33 hours of downtime, Daniel said. Yes. You found it. I did. After... Elmwood read the log. After the manufacturer's technical team couldn't identify the fault. They identified the general area. They didn't find the specific component because it wasn't in their standard diagnostic protocol. It's a passive circuit. The monitoring software doesn't query it directly. How did you know to look there? It was the same question Priya had asked him. He gave Elmwood a version of the same answer, but more specifically technical. The smell, the absence of actual heat signature, the physical inconsistency between what the system was reporting and what the machine's physical state indicated. He described the oxidation failure mode, the humidity-temperature interaction, the specific load conditions that had pushed the contact resistance past its functional limit. Elmwood listened to all of it. Then, you have a background in relay circuit design. I have patents in that area, Daniel said. Yes. Elmwood looked at him steadily. And you were a maintenance technician here. I was. Why? It was the same question Olivia had asked. Daniel gave him a shorter version of the same answer. A sentence, clean and without apology. Family reasons. The role fit what I needed at the time. Elmwood nodded. It was a nod that didn't push further, the nod of a man who had asked a question and received an honest answer and respected it enough not to keep pulling the thread. And the oxidation protocol you developed, he said. It's being applied to all production lines? Lines 4, 7, and 9 are already done. Lines 2, 3, and 6 are scheduled for next week. The full rollout will be complete within the month, including the revised humidity thresholds. Including the revised thresholds, yes. We've also opened a formal inquiry with the machine manufacturer about the gap in their customer service bulletin distribution. There's a question of whether other facilities running their equipment have received adequate notification about this failure mode. Elmwood wrote something. He closed his notebook. He looked at the machine running clean and steady in front of him, the relay access panel closed and labeled and logged, the control screens green across their full array. The failure documentation is detailed, he said. Yes. Your response time was fast. It could have been faster, Daniel said. It was the honest thing to say, and he said it without self-punishment, just as a fact. The fault was identifiable earlier than we got to it. We're working on the diagnostic framework that should catch this class of issues sooner going forward. Elmwood looked at him. Most companies don't admit that in front of a potential client. Most companies haven't just spent 33 hours watching a $5 million machine sit silent, Daniel said. It adjusts your relationship with optimism. Something shifted in Elmwood's expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the movement of a man who has been doing something a long time and occasionally, unexpectedly, encounters something genuine enough to acknowledge. He turned and walked toward line 9. Daniel fell into step beside him. They walked the rest of the floor together, mostly in silence, which was the most comfortable silence Daniel had experienced in a professional context in a long time. Elmwood asked questions when he had them. Daniel answered when he could and said, I don't know when he couldn't, which happened twice. And both times he said who to ask instead. And both times the person he named was available and answered correctly. At 11:30, Elmwood's quality assurance man, his name was Bertrand, Daniel had learned, and he was exactly as meticulous as his job required, found something on line 3. Not a failure, not a safety issue. A worn sealing gasket on a secondary hydraulic fitting caught by Bertrand's practiced eye during a close inspection of the hydraulic assembly. The gasket wasn't leaking, it wasn't at a failure threshold, but it was visibly worn and should have been flagged for replacement on the previous maintenance cycle. Bertrand showed it to Elmwood. Elmwood looked at it. He looked at Daniel. Daniel crouched down and looked at it properly. He stood up. "That's a 6-month gasket that's run about 8 months," he said. "It's not at failure, but it should have been caught on the last scheduled inspection." He looked at Marco, who had appeared nearby. "Pull the maintenance log for line 3 hydraulic assembly, last 3 inspection cycles." Marco pulled it on his tablet. He brought it over. Daniel read it. "Flagged 2 cycles ago as monitor for wear. Didn't make it to schedule replacement on the follow-up." He looked at Elmwood. "That's a documentation gap. The follow-up action wasn't closed out. I'll have a corrective procedure in place by end of week." "Can you replace it today?" Bertrand asked. "This afternoon," Daniel said. "Carl—" He looked at Briggs, who was standing nearby. Carl nodded and was already moving. Elmwood watched this. The exchange, the immediate response, the lack of defensive explanation or elaborate qualification. He watched Bertrand make a note. He watched Daniel watch Briggs go. "You're not going to tell me it's within acceptable parameters?" Elmwood asked. "It's within acceptable parameters," Daniel said. "It's also a gap that shouldn't exist. Both things are true. Telling you one without the other would be a waste of your time." Elmwood was quiet for a moment. "How many other facilities would have told me one without the other?" "Most of them," Daniel said. "But you already know that." Elmwood almost smiled. He looked at the hydraulic fitting. He looked at the floor. He made a note in his leather book, the small, specific note of a man cataloging not a failure, but a response to a failure. And Daniel understood from 20 years of being in the industry that those two things were weighted very differently in the final assessment. By 1 in the afternoon, the technical review was complete. Elmwood's analyst had worked through the full documentation package. Bertrand had covered every production line. The quality audit checklist, which Elmwood had shared in advance, one of the few courtesies of a thorough man, was complete with 3 items marked for follow-up, all of which had been addressed before 3 o'clock. The hydraulic gasket on line 3 was replaced by Carl Briggs at 2:15 and logged with a note about the corrective procedure Daniel had drafted during lunch in 15 minutes. At 3, Elmwood asked for 30 minutes alone with Olivia. Daniel went to the floor. Not because he needed to be there, as everything was running, the review was done, his job for the day was essentially complete. He went because the floor was where he thought clearly, had been for 2.5 years, and there were things he wanted to think about clearly. He walked line 7. He stood at the main panel and looked at the control screens, green across the board, all nominal, the relay access panel beside him closed and labeled and functioning exactly as it was supposed to. He thought about the 33 hours this machine had been silent and what that silence had cost, and what it had ultimately produced, which was not something he would have predicted if you'd asked him the morning before it happened. He thought about Priya Sandhu at 1 in the morning, running failover tests with her notebook open. About Tom Garrett and the car analogy and the way his shoulders had come down when he understood it. About Webb in the hallway saying, "I've been wrong about a few things," the roughness in his voice that was the sound of honesty costing something. About Carl Briggs pulling the Line 9 relay without being asked and logging it as routine. He thought about Olivia in her office with the dead plant in the corner, drafting a role description that was more letter than document. He thought about Sophie's drawing of the motor, the labels in block letters, the magnets arguing the only way to resolve it is to keep spinning. He didn't have a clean way to think about what the last 3 weeks had been. He wasn't a person who organized experience into lessons. He'd found, in his 30s, that life didn't really work like that, didn't organize itself into the shape of a story with a clear takeaway. Things happened and you dealt with them and they changed you in ways that mostly you didn't notice until later. The grief had been like that. The choice to leave Meridian had been like that. The decision to stay small, stay quiet, stay within the walls he'd built. That too. What he knew was this. Standing near a wall with a thermos was sometimes the right choice. Sometimes the room wasn't listening and pushing didn't help, and the better move was to wait for a moment when being heard was actually possible. He didn't regret the waiting. He had needed those years. Sophie had needed them. The particular life he'd built around the particular shape of her childhood. That was real, and it had been right, and he wouldn't undo it. But he also knew that the waiting had cost something. Not just in the narrow professional sense, in the larger sense of what happened when you practiced invisibility long enough. The walls that kept things out also kept things in. The quiet he'd cultivated to protect himself and Sophie had eventually become its own kind of cage, one he'd stopped noticing because he was so used to living in it. Olivia had opened a door, not kicked it down, not made a ceremony of it, just quietly indicated that there was a door, and that it could open if he chose to push it. He'd pushed it. He was still figuring out what was on the other side. At 3:45, Patrick appeared on the floor. He walked to Daniel with the particular pace of someone carrying news and not sure yet how to characterize it. Daniel looked at him. "She wants you in the conference room," Patrick said. "Elmwood still there?" They're both waiting. Daniel set down the inspection log he'd been reviewing. He rolled his shoulder, the old habit, and followed Patrick. The conference room had the slightly charged atmosphere of a space where something had recently been decided. Olivia was standing at the window with her coffee. Elmwood was seated at the table, his leather notebook open, Bertrand beside him. The analyst was gone, sent to compile something, Daniel guessed. He sat down. Elmwood looked at him for a moment, then at Olivia, then back at Daniel. "I have some observations," he said. "I want to share them directly." "Please," Daniel said. "Your facility has documented weaknesses," Elmwood said. "The gasket issue on line 3 is minor, but it's indicative of a maintenance tracking gap that's systemic. Your documentation protocols for follow-up action items need tightening, not a large project, but a real one. And your operator training records for the redundancy system are less detailed than I'd like to see." He paused. "Those are the gaps." Another pause. "What your facility also has," he said, "is something I don't see as often as I should. You had a major system failure 3 weeks ago, a 33-hour shutdown on your primary production line. The kind of event that, at a lot of companies, gets cleaned up and papered over and presented to a visiting inspector as if it never happened." He looked at his notebook. "You documented it completely. You traced the root cause. You developed a protocol to prevent recurrence, and you applied that protocol proactively to adjacent systems. You identified a secondary failure risk, the redundancy timing issue, that had nothing to do with the original shutdown, and you corrected it before it became a problem." He looked up. "You didn't wait for me to find it. You found it yourself." The room was quiet. "The gasket on line 3, he continued. "Most facilities would have argued the acceptable parameters case and scheduled the replacement quietly after I left. You replaced it in front of me and put a corrective procedure in writing this afternoon." He looked at Olivia. "I've been doing supplier evaluations for 21 years. The thing I'm looking for is not perfection. Perfection doesn't exist in manufacturing operations. What I'm looking for is how an organization responds when things aren't perfect." He closed his notebook. "Fletcher Industrial would like to proceed with the contract," he said. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Olivia said, "Good," in a voice that was entirely controlled and entirely failed to conceal that she'd been carrying the weight of this for months. Elmwood looked at Daniel. "One question, and you don't have to answer it." "All right. The relay. The 33 hours, the manufacturer's team, the engineers running diagnostics. You found the fault in the end. But you knew earlier. How much earlier?" Daniel held his gaze. "I had a strong suspicion within the first 2 hours. I wasn't certain enough to say definitively until I had the component in my hand." "But you had the suspicion." "Yes." "And you waited." "I tried early. The engineering team was focused on a different diagnostic path. I waited until I could get to someone who was actually asking." Elmwood nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone filing something away, not for judgment, but for understanding. "That's a failure mode too," he said, "not yours. Organizational. When the person who knows the answer can't get the answer heard." He looked at Olivia. "I'd think about that." "I have been," she said. "We're thinking about it." "Good." Elmwood stood. Bertrand stood. "We'll have the formal paperwork to your legal team by end of week." He shook Olivia's hand. He looked at Daniel. "You should have been in that room from the beginning." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm in it now." Delwood left. The room held what it held for a moment, the particular exhale of a thing resolved, the kind of quiet that had texture and weight. Patrick made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Olivia set her coffee down carefully and looked at the table. "He's right," she said. She wasn't looking at Daniel. She was looking at the table, at the space where Delwood's notebook had been. "About the organizational failure, I want to put together a process review, how technical knowledge moves through this company, who gets heard in what rooms." She looked up. "That's something I want you involved in." "Yeah," Daniel said. "Okay." She looked at him for a moment. "How are you doing?" The question caught him slightly off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but just because it was personal, and personal wasn't the register they'd mostly been operating in. "Fine," he said, and then, because she was looking at him with the expression of someone who was actually asking, "Better than I thought I'd be." "Were you worried? About the inspection?" He considered this. "I was worried about the things I couldn't control, Delwood's judgment, whether what we'd done in 10 days was enough, whether," he paused, "whether being right about the failover issue was going to matter if we hadn't had time to fix it properly." "But we did." "We did." He looked at the window. "Priya's work on the PLC configuration was excellent. Better than I would have done it, probably. That's not me being modest. She studied that system specifically. She knew it better than I did. And you knew to ask her." He looked at Olivia. "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" he said. "Not any one person having all the answers, knowing who has which answer and making sure they can get it into the room." She held his gaze. "That's the whole thing," she said. Patrick cleared his throat gently from the doorway. He'd gone to make a call and come back and was now standing with the slightly awkward energy of someone who has walked into a moment that doesn't require him. "Legal is going to want to review the contract terms before end of week," he said. "And I have about 14 emails that need your attention." Olivia looked at him. "Give me 5 minutes." He retreated. She looked back at Daniel. "There's going to be a company meeting," she said. "I want to tell everyone what happened, the full story, the shutdown, how it was found, who found it. Not as a," she paused, searching for the right word, "not as a performance, but because people deserve to understand how this company almost lost something, and how it didn't." Daniel looked at her steadily. "You're going to put my name on it?" "Yes." "I'd rather—" He stopped. He thought about what he'd rather. He thought about the walls and the quiet and the practiced invisibility. He thought about what it had cost. He thought about Sophie at the break room table asking if he'd still pick her up at 3, and about Helen saying whether it's real. He thought about Webb in the hallway and Priya's notebook and the hydraulic gasket on line 3 replaced before Delwood left the building. He thought about the things that happened because somebody in a room asked the right question of the right person. "All right," he said. "Put my name on it." She nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for that either," he said. "It's just true. And true things should be said." She picked up her coffee. She was almost smiling. "You're going to be annoying to work with," she said. "Probably," he said. "You knew that when you hired me." He left the conference room. He walked the corridor he'd walked 100 times as a maintenance technician. The same fluorescent lights, the same smell of machine oil and industrial cleaning solution, the same distant sound of the plant floor operating, and it felt the same and different simultaneously, the way a familiar place feels when you come back to it with new information. He stopped at the engineering station. Webb was there, at his desk, and looked up when Daniel came in. "Delwood?" he asked. "We got it." Webb let out a breath, a real one, the breath of someone who'd been holding something without fully realizing it. The failover timing? He tested it, 4.7 seconds. He was satisfied. "Priya's going to be insufferable," Webb said. He said it with the specific warmth of someone who would be pleased to be insufferable about it themselves if the situation were reversed. "She earned it," Daniel said. "She did." Webb looked at him for a moment. "You did too." Daniel pulled out the chair at the adjacent desk. The desk he'd been thinking of as his, the one that didn't have his name on it yet, and didn't have anything in the drawers and still had the previous occupant's coffee ring on the surface that nobody had gotten around to cleaning. He sat down. He pulled the folded contract from his shirt pocket and set it on the desk. It was worn at the folds now, soft at the creases, the way paper got when you handled it more than you meant to. "I'm going to need a proper desk," he said. Webb looked at the coffee ring. "Yeah," he said. "You probably should have said something sooner." "Story of my life," Daniel said, and for the first time in a long time he said it without the weight behind it, just as a fact. A true thing, said plainly, without the years of bitterness or grief or careful practiced quiet pressing down on it. Webb turned back to his screen. Daniel opened his laptop. The engineering station hummed around them, screens and data and the background noise of a plant in full operation. The company meeting happened on a Thursday. The whole facility gathered in the main floor space, production workers, engineers, administrative staff, supervisors. Folding chairs had been brought out, and most people were standing anyway. The way people stood at things they hadn't entirely been sure they'd care about and found themselves caring about more than expected. Olivia stood at the front, no podium, no prepared notes on the lectern-style stand someone had brought out. She talked for about 15 minutes. She told them what had happened, the shutdown, the 33 hours, the engineers and the manufacturer's team, and the $1 million system replacement that had been on the table. She told them who had fixed it and how. She didn't make it into a fairy tale. She said the fault was findable earlier and wasn't found earlier because the person who saw it wasn't being heard. She said that was on the organization, not on any one individual. She said they were working on it and that working on it meant actually changing things, not putting up a poster about listening. She talked about the Fletcher inspection. The failover issue found the week before. The hydraulic gasket on line 3. Priya Sandhu's PLC work at 1 in the morning. Carl Briggs pulling the line 9 relay. Marco's floor logs. Tom Garrett explaining the redundancy system with a car analogy that a 60-year-old procurement VP had found compelling enough to write in his notebook. She said, "The person who saved this contract is not one person, but there is a person who started the chain, and he was standing near a wall with a thermos for 33 hours while we looked everywhere else." She looked at Daniel, who was standing toward the back because he'd gotten there late from dropping Sophie at school and hadn't wanted to push through the crowd. The room looked at him. He didn't do anything with this. He stood there and let it happen, which was harder than it sounds and easier than he'd thought it would be. He'd spent 6 years learning to be invisible, and the room was looking at him, and he didn't disappear, which was, he thought, probably the point. Someone started clapping, and then more people, and more. Marco, who was standing near the front, was clapping with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting 3 weeks to do it. Carl Briggs. Priya Sandhu, who caught Daniel's eye and nodded once, the nod of someone who had learned something and was still learning it. Webb, standing beside Priya, with the expression of a man processing the specific humility of knowing that someone next to him knew more than he did and had known it for years, and that this was, on balance, a good thing to know. Daniel nodded back at all of it. He didn't say anything. He'd never been comfortable with this part. The recognition, the room turning toward him, the weight of 100 people deciding what they thought. He'd felt it at Meridian at award dinners and patent signings and project completions, and he'd always been slightly wrong-footed by it, never quite sure what to do with his face or his hands. He was still slightly wrong-footed by it now. He was standing there with his hands in his pockets, slightly too warm in the crowd, trying to figure out where to look, and some part of him registered that this imperfect, awkward relationship with being seen was probably not going to go away just because the circumstances had changed. You didn't fix that kind of thing in 3 weeks. You just let the room look at you and didn't run. Afterward, in the parking lot, his phone buzzed. Helen. Patrick texted me. "Congratulations, call me later." And then, a second message. "Sophie wants to know if you'll show her the machines this weekend." He stood in the cold October air and read the messages and thought about Sophie at his desk in the engineering station, which he was now going to have to figure out whether or how to make work. He thought about the liability concerns this would raise with HR and about the fact that he was going to care about those liability concerns a manageable amount and no more. He typed back, "Tell her yes." Saturday morning. He drove to the school for pickup. Sophie was waiting at the gate in her coat, backpack on, the one sock up and one sock falling down issue apparently an eternal condition. She saw him and ran, which she still did at 7, which he had been told she would stop doing at some point and had decided not to think about. She crashed into him at approximately the velocity of a small comet. He caught her, which he was still, at 32, physically capable of doing, though it had gotten meaningfully harder than it used to be. "How was your day?" she asked his shoulder. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually." She leaned back to look at him with the sharp assessment of a person who measured people by the texture of their answers rather than the words. Different good or normal good? He thought about the conference room, about Elmwood saying Fletcher Industrial would like to proceed, about Olivia not thanking him for saying the true thing because she'd understood he didn't want that, about the room looking at him and him staying, and about Webb and Priya and Carl and all the small different ways that a place could change without any one dramatic moment to point to. "Different good," he said. She nodded, satisfied. She wiggled down and took his hand and started walking toward the car, already talking about something that had happened in third period involving a hamster that was allegedly named after a character from a television program he'd never heard of. And he listened to all of it, the full detailed account, with the complete attention of someone who understood that the particular story being told to you right now was the most important one in the room. The machines at Ridgeway Technologies kept running. They would keep running through the night and into the following week, and through the first delivery to Fletcher Industrial 45 days later, on time, within spec, documented to a standard that Elmwood's team reviewed and approved without a single note. They would keep running through the winter when Daniel's maintenance protocol identified 2 more relay components across the facility approaching the oxidation threshold, both flagged and corrected before they caused a fault. Through the spring, when Priya Sandhu published a technical paper on PLC optimization in high-humidity industrial environments, with a footnote acknowledging the practical diagnostic work that had informed her analysis, attributed to D. Brooks. Through the following fall, when Webb recommended Daniel for an industry working group on secondary circuit failure documentation, the kind of recommendation that a year earlier would have been unimaginable from that direction. And Daniel went home at 6 every morning during his remaining nights on the floor, and then at 4:30 on the new schedule. And he was there for school pickup at 3, non-negotiable, every day. He taught Sophie the names of the motor components she'd laid out on the paper towel in Mrs. Paulson's classroom. He signed the permission slips. He made breakfast for dinner when logistics required it, and she still treated it as a special occasion, which he had decided to let her do for as long as it lasted. He kept the folded contract in the top drawer of his desk in the engineering station, the desk with the coffee ring someone had eventually gotten around to cleaning, and then his own coffee ring had formed, and he'd decided not to clean it either, for reasons that were more sentimental than he would have admitted out loud. He wasn't a changed man, in the sense that he was still fundamentally the same person he'd been standing near that wall with his thermos. Still quiet, still unhurried. Still the kind of person who filed observations in the back of his mind and waited for the moment when saying them would actually land. Still imperfect in the specific ways he'd always been imperfect. Slightly too sure of his own analysis, occasionally impatient with people who moved slower through a problem than he did, still slightly wrong-footed by recognition and not sure what to do with his face. But the walls were different, not gone. Walls that have been load-bearing for 6 years don't come down in a season, but different. Doorways where there hadn't been doorways, light in places that had been dark. He thought about Claire sometimes, at his desk in the engineering station. He thought about what she would make of all this, the relay and the inspection, and the room looking at him and the contract in the drawer. He thought she would have an opinion, which she always had. He thought she would probably say something that mixed genuine pride with a joke at his expense, because that had been her specific skill set, and he had always needed both. He missed her with the soft, persistent ache of later grief, the kind that was no longer an emergency, just a fact. Permanent, unchanging, requiring no action, just true. He carried it the way he carried most things, quietly, without making a show of it, without letting it stop him from doing the work in front of him. The machines told you what was wrong if you knew how to listen. He knew how to listen. He went back to work.